There is a city that no longer exists. You won't find it on any map you own. You could stand on the exact ground where it once rose and feel nothing under your feet but concrete and traffic and the ordinary noise of an ordinary afternoon. Cars, construction, a vendor calling out prices, the smell of fried food and exhaust. Nothing about that street would tell you what it is built on top of. But 500 years ago, on that same spot, there stood one of the largest, cleanest, most impossibly beautiful cities that human beings had ever made. A city built on water, threaded with canals instead of streets, gardens that floated on the surface of a lake, causeways wide enough for 10 men to walk abreast, running straight as drawn lines toward white towers that caught fire with color when the sun came up over the mountains. 200,000 people lived there, maybe more, at a time when most European cities held a fraction of that. It was bigger than London, bigger than Rome. The men who would eventually destroy it stood on a ridge above the valley, looked down at it for the first time, and some of them later admitted they wondered if they were dreaming. Soldiers who had crossed an ocean, men who had seen the great ports of Spain and Italy, and they looked at this and could not find the words. And then, in the space of about 2 years, it was gone. Not faded, not slowly forgotten, not abandoned and reclaimed by jungle the way some ruins are. Torn down, burned, drowned in its own canals, pulled apart stone by stone, until the people who had ruled an empire of millions were reduced to digging through rubble for something to eat, drinking water so foul it killed them, and surrendering in a canoe at the edge of a lake that had once been the center of their world. How does that happen? That's the question. Hold on to it, because everything that follows is an attempt to answer it, and the answer is stranger and darker and far more human than the version most of us were taught. Because we were taught a simple story. A few hundred Spaniards with steel and horses and guns walked into a continent and toppled an empire of millions, almost by accident, as if it were easy, as if it were inevitable. It was not easy. It was not inevitable. And the people who did it came within a single night of being slaughtered to the last man. What actually destroyed the empire was not really the swords. It was something the empire couldn't see coming, because it came from inside its own beliefs, from inside the bodies of its own people, and from inside the mind of one man who sat at the very top of the world and felt, for reasons he could never fully explain to anyone, that something was coming for him. His name was Moctezuma, and before we can understand how his world ended, you have to understand what that world was. Because to feel the size of what was lost, you have to first feel how high it stood. So let's go back. Before the strangers, before the sails appeared on the eastern water, before any of it, let's walk into the city while it's still alive. To reach it, you came across the water. There was no other way. The city sat on islands in the middle of a vast lake, in a high valley ringed by mountains, 2 great volcanoes standing over everything with snow on their shoulders even under a tropical sun. From a distance, the city seemed to float, a thing made of light and stone resting on the surface of the lake, with thin, straight roads reaching out to it from the shore like the spokes of a wheel. Those roads were the causeways, built by hand, packed earth and stone laid down across open water, with gaps in them spanned by wooden bridges that could be pulled up. Remember those bridges. Remember that they could be pulled up. That detail is going to come back, and when it does, it's going to cost more lives than you can easily imagine. You walked the causeway into the city, and the closer you came, the more the air filled with sound. Drums, conch shells, the cries of thousands of voices in a language built out of soft, rolling syllables. And smell. Flowers, wood smoke, copal incense rising in pale threads from 100 temples, and underneath it all, the green, wet smell of the lake. The people called themselves the Mexica. We tend to call them the Aztecs, a word they didn't really use for themselves. They called their city Tenochtitlan. And by the time our story begins, they ruled a web of cities and tribute states that stretched from coast to coast, draining wealth and food and human beings inward toward the capital, like water spiraling toward a drain. But here's the thing that almost nobody tells you. 200 years before all of this, the Mexica had been nobody. Nothing. Less than nothing. They came into the valley as the last and the least of the wandering tribes, latecomers, outsiders. Everybody else had already claimed the good land around the lake, and the established cities looked at these ragged newcomers with their strange customs and their hungry war god, and decided they were useful only as mercenaries and as a problem to be pushed around. The Mexica were so unwelcome that at one point they were driven onto a miserable scrap of swampy island in the middle of the lake that nobody else wanted, snake-infested, half-flooded, worthless. And on that worthless island, they built the most powerful city in the Americas. How they explained it to themselves was through a sign. Their priests had told them, generations earlier, that they would wander until they saw an eagle perched on a cactus, devouring a serpent. When they saw that sign, they were home. And on that swampy island, the story goes, they saw it. The eagle, the cactus, the snake. So they stayed. They drove wooden pilings down into the mud. They dredged the lakebed and piled it up to make land. They built rafts, anchored them, layered them with rich black mud from the bottom of the lake, and grew crops on the water itself. Those floating gardens, the chinampas, so fertile they could feed a city through harvest after harvest after harvest. They turned a curse into the foundation of an empire. And that origin story matters because it shaped how they saw themselves. They were the chosen ones who had risen from nothing. They were the people the gods had picked to carry the weight of the world. And that weight, that was the strangest and most terrible part of who they were. Because the Mexica believed that the universe was not stable. They believed it had already ended 4 times before. 4 worlds, 4 suns, each one created and then destroyed. By jaguars, by wind, by fire, by flood. They believed they were living in the 5th world, the 5th sun, and that this one would also end. The only question was when. And they believed that the only thing holding back that ending, the only thing keeping the sun moving across the sky each day, was blood. Human blood. The gods had bled themselves to set the world in motion at the dawn of the 5th sun, and so the debt had to be repaid, forever, in kind. The sun was a warrior who fought the darkness every single night and had to be fed to fight again at dawn. So they fed it. This is the part of the story people recoil from, and I'm not going to soften it, because you cannot understand what comes later if you flinch away from it now. The Mexica practiced human sacrifice on a scale that is genuinely difficult for the modern mind to hold. Captives taken in war were marched up the steps of the Great Pyramid in the heart of the city, bent backward over a stone, and opened with an obsidian blade. Their hearts were lifted up, still beating, toward the sun. Their bodies were rolled back down the steps that ran red and stayed red. But here's what I need you to understand. To them, this was not cruelty for its own sake. It was duty. It was the heaviest responsibility in existence. They genuinely believed that if the offering stopped, the sun would stop, the world would freeze, and everything, every child, every field, every star, would be swallowed by a darkness that had already devoured 4 worlds before this one. They thought they were saving reality itself. Now sit with the irony of that for a moment, because here is a people who built their entire civilization around a single, all-consuming fear. The fear that their world was going to end. They organized everything around holding off the ending. They spilled oceans of blood to delay it. And it was coming anyway. Not in the way they imagined, not by jaguars or fire or flood, but it was coming, from across the sea, and it would be more total than anything in their darkest cosmology, because when the Mexica imagined the end of the world, at least they imagined that something would remember it. But hold that thought, we're not there yet. Let's stay in the living city a little longer, because there's so much you need to see. The market alone could undo you. In the district of Tlatelolco, just north of the Great Temple, There was a marketplace so vast that tens of thousands of people moved through it every single day. The Spaniards who saw it later said they had never witnessed anything like it anywhere in the world, not in Constantinople, not in Rome. Everything under the sun was for sale, and everything had its own ordered place. Gold and jade and the green tail feathers of the Quetzal bird, so prized they were worth more than gold. Cloth woven so fine, it felt like water. Cacao beans, which were so valuable, they were literally used as money. You could buy your dinner with chocolate. Medicines, dyes, obsidian blades, slaves, live animals, vegetables piled in pyramids of color. And it was orderly. There were judges sitting in the market to settle disputes on the spot. There were officials who walked the rows checking that no one cheated. This was not chaos. This was not a primitive people stumbling around in the dark, whatever you may have been told. This was one of the most sophisticated, organized, administratively complex societies on Earth. They had aqueducts that carried fresh spring water from the mainland into the heart of the city because the lake itself was brackish, undrinkable. Remember that too, the aqueduct. The city of 200,000 people surrounded by water it could not drink, depending on a thin stone channel for its life. Cut that channel and the city dies of thirst in the middle of a lake. Someone is going to figure that out. Not yet, but someone will. They had a system of public sanitation that put European cities to shame. The streets were swept. Human waste was collected and carried out to fertilize the chinampas. Nothing wasted. There were public toilets along the causeways. Visitors from Spain, coming from cities where people threw their filth into the gutters, and the plague never really left, walked into Tenochtitlan and found it cleaner than anywhere they had ever lived. That fact should sit uncomfortably with you, and I want it to. They had schools, compulsory schools, for boys and for girls, both noble and common, something Europe wouldn't manage for centuries. They had a calendar of staggering precision, 2 interlocking wheels of days that meshed together and only realigned once every 52 years. They had poetry, real, aching, philosophical poetry, written and performed and treasured by kings, poetry that asked questions we still don't have answers to. Is anything we make real? Does anything last? Are we only here on the earth for a moment, like a flower that opens and is gone? One of the greatest of their poet kings, who ruled the city of Texcoco across the lake, wrote and spoke verses obsessed with exactly this: the brief, fragile, heartbreaking impermanence of everything beautiful. He looked at jade and gold and the most precious things human hands could make, and he said, in effect, even these break. Even these we leave behind. Nothing stays. He had no idea how completely his world was about to prove him right. And ruling over all of it, over the city, the lake, the markets, the temples, the tribute pouring in from every direction, was the man we started with, Moctezuma II, the great speaker, the closest thing on that continent to a living god. You did not look at him. That was the law. When he passed, people lowered their eyes to the ground, because to meet his gaze was forbidden. He did not touch the earth with his own feet in public. Nobles spread cloths before him so the dust would not soil him. He ate behind a screen so that no one could watch the divine mouth take food. He changed his clothes 4 times a day and never wore the same garment twice. Hundreds of servants attended him. He had a palace with a zoo, with aviaries full of birds, with rooms full of human beings born with unusual features whom he kept as part of his household. He had a garden of flowers and another of medicinal herbs. He had absolute power over life and death across an empire of millions. And he was, by every account we have, deeply, secretly afraid. Because something was wrong. He could feel it before he could name it. We'll get to the strangers. We'll get to the sails on the Eastern Sea. But before any of that, before any human being on those islands had ever seen a European, the chronicles tell us that Moctezuma was already a man being slowly hollowed out by dread. And the things that frightened him were not armies, because no army on the continent could touch him. What frightened him were signs. and the signs had already begun. Some of these omens may have been invented later, after everything had already collapsed, by people desperate to make sense of how a world could fall apart so fast. We have to be honest about that. When a civilization is destroyed, the survivors look backward and find meaning everywhere. Every strange cloud, every bad dream, suddenly becomes a warning that was always there. Memory rewrites itself. So when the old men later described the years before the strangers came, we can't always know what truly happened and what grief and hindsight stitched together afterward. But that's almost the point. Whether the omens were real or remembered into being, the fear was real, the dread was real, and it tells you something profound about the psychology of a people who lived every day under the belief that the sky could fall, that when their world finally did begin to end, they had already half expected it for years. So here is what they remembered. They remembered a tongue of fire in the sky, a column of light, narrow at the bottom and spreading at the top like a wound bleeding upward, that appeared in the east in the dead of night and burned there for hours, for nights on end. We would probably call it a comet. They called it a sign. And it terrified them because it came from the east. In the east was where the sun was born. The east was the direction of beginnings, and now something was burning there in the dark. They remembered the great temple catching fire for no reason anyone could find. No lightning, no torch dropped. The wooden pillars simply began to burn from within, and when they threw water on the flames, the water made them roar higher, as if the fire were feeding on the thing meant to put it out. The house of their fiercest god, burning, and nothing they did could stop it. They remembered a sudden boiling of the lake, the water rising up without wind, without earthquake, flooding into the city and tearing houses loose from their foundations. The lake that fed them, the lake that protected them, turning against them out of a clear and windless sky. And they remembered the voice, a woman weeping in the night, moving through the empty streets after dark, crying out to her children. Some said they heard her say that it was time to flee, time to go far away. Some said she cried, "Where can I take you so you will not be lost?" A grieving mother with no face, walking the canals in the dark, mourning children who weren't dead yet. Sit with how unsettling that is. Not a monster, not an army, a mother, weeping for what was coming. And there were more. A bird brought to Moctezuma with a strange mirror set in its head, and when he looked into the mirror he saw, the story goes, the night sky in daylight. And then he saw something else moving across it. People, warriors, mounted on the backs of animals like deer, coming on in ranks for war. Twisted, two-headed creatures dragged before him that vanished the moment he turned his eyes away. Fishermen who pulled strange things from the lake. Dreams, so many dreams. And the man at the center of all of it, the God King, the most powerful human being on the continent, could do nothing but watch the signs accumulate and feel the floor of his certainty tilting beneath him. This is the part of Moctezuma that history has been cruel to. He's often painted as a coward, as weak, as a man who froze when he should have fought. But I want you to imagine standing where he stood. You are not just a ruler. You are the living link between your people and the divine. You hold up the sky, and the sky is sending you message after message that something is coming, and you cannot tell what, and there is no one above you to ask, because you are the top. You are the one everyone else asks. The loneliness of that is almost unbearable. He consulted his priests, he consulted his sorcerers and his readers of signs, and the chronicles say that some of the answers displeased him so much that he had the men who gave them imprisoned or killed, or simply made to vanish. He sent magicians to find the source of the trouble, and they came back saying their power had failed, that something stronger than their magic had entered the world. A man surrounded by thousands of servants who could not get a single answer he could trust. A god who could feel his own godhood failing him. And then the news came up from the coast. Strangers, on the eastern sea, the very direction the tongue of fire had burned. It came in pieces, the way bad news always does, each piece worse than the last. First, just a sighting, something floating on the water far out from the shore. Towers, the coastal people said, moving on the sea. Mountains that drifted. Houses that floated, with great white wings, full of pale men with hair on their faces. Because this wasn't even the first contact. Years before the real invasion, ships had drifted near the coast. Survivors of a Spanish shipwreck had washed ashore in the Maya lands far to the southeast, and word of pale, bearded strangers had been trickling inward for a while. The Mexica knew, vaguely, that something was out there. But it had stayed at the edge of the world, a rumor, a curiosity. Now it was coming closer, and it was coming in numbers. In the year they would have called one reed, a year, by a coincidence so perfect it feels designed, heavy with old prophecy, the floating mountains stopped drifting past the coast. They stopped, and men came down out of them onto the sand. This is the moment the two worlds touch. After thousands of years of growing up in total isolation from each other, two halves of the human species that had never known the other existed, that had developed different plants, different animals, different gods, different diseases, different ideas about what a human being even was, were about to stand face to face on a beach. And almost nothing about that meeting was going to go the way either side imagined. Because here is what makes this story so much more than a simple tale of conquest. The men who came out of those ships were not an army. Not really. They were a few hundred adventurers, treasure hunters, second sons with nothing to lose, led by a man who was, at that very moment, technically a criminal. A man who had defied his own governor to even be there, who had sailed against orders, who had burned his bridges so completely that going home meant prison or death. He had everything to lose and nothing to go back to, which made him the most dangerous kind of man alive. His name was Hernán Cortés. And to understand what happened next, you have to understand that this was not a confident empire sending a war fleet to conquer a known enemy. This was a desperate gamble by a brilliant, ruthless, silver-tongued opportunist who was making it up as he went, who had no idea what was waiting inland, who was vastly outnumbered, and who, crucially, understood from almost the first moment that he could not win this with force. He would have to win it another way, with words, with lies, with alliances, by finding the cracks already running through this empire and driving his fingers into them until they split wide open. And the cracks were there. Oh, they were there. Because the great secret of the Aztec Empire, the thing Cortés would discover and exploit with terrifying speed, was that it was hated. We'll come back to Cortés. We'll come back to the beach. But first you have to understand the hatred, because without it, none of this works. Without it, those few hundred men die in the first month and we never hear their names again. Remember the blood. Remember the sun that had to be fed. All those captives marched up the temple steps. Where did they come from? They came from war. And war, for the Mexica, was not only about land or wealth, it was about taking prisoners. The empire needed a constant supply of human beings to offer to the gods, and so it waged war partly in order to capture people. They had even institutionalized this into a kind of ritualized combat with certain enemy states. Battles fought not to destroy the enemy, but to harvest captives from them, year after year, generation after generation. Now imagine being one of those subject peoples. Imagine living in a city or a region that had been conquered by the Mexica. You don't just pay tribute, your gold, your cloth, your food, your labor, flowing endlessly toward a capital you'll never see. You also live with the knowledge that the empire might come for your sons and your husbands, that they might be dragged up those steps and opened over a stone to feed a god that isn't even your god. You would not love that empire. You would fear it. And underneath the fear, you would hate it with a patience that runs bone deep. The Aztec Empire was not a unified nation. It was a vast machine of domination, holding down dozens of peoples who had been beaten into submission but never truly absorbed, never made loyal. Peoples who remembered being free, who nursed old grievances, who were waiting, without even daring to name the hope, for something to change. And then, something walked out of the sea that could change everything. The genius of Cortés, and it was genius, however much you may hate where he aimed it, was that he saw this almost immediately. He didn't see one monolithic empire. He saw a structure under enormous internal pressure. He saw the fault lines. And he realized that he didn't need to bring an army from Spain. He could build one out of the empire's own enemies. But let's go back to that beach. Spring of the year we'd call 1519. The ships drop anchor off the coast of what's now Mexico, near where the city of Veracruz stands today, and roughly 550 men come ashore, with 16 horses, a handful of small cannon, some crossbows, and a deep, gnawing uncertainty about whether any of them will ever see Spain again. 550 men. Hold that number against the empire of millions waiting inland, against a single city of 200,000, 550, and their leader was already a wanted man. Cortés had talked his way into command of this expedition under the authority of the governor of Cuba, a man named Velázquez. But the two of them had a history of bad blood, and at the last moment, Velázquez tried to strip Cortés of the command. Cortés simply ignored the order and sailed anyway. From the very first day, he was operating outside the law, knowing that the governor would send men to arrest him, knowing that if this expedition failed, or even if it succeeded in the wrong way, he would hang for it. So he did something extraordinary, something that tells you everything about the kind of mind you're dealing with. He invented a loophole. He gathered his men and had them formally found a town right there on the beach, a town that existed mostly on paper, a few huts and a name. And because a town in the Spanish system answered directly to the King of Spain, and because the town's newly created council then elected Cortés as its leader, he had, in a single bureaucratic sleight of hand, cut the legal cord that tied him to the governor of Cuba and reattached himself directly to the crown. It was paperwork as a weapon. He couldn't be a rogue captain disobeying a governor if he was the lawful chief magistrate of a brand new Spanish town reporting to the king himself. He had legalized his own rebellion. And then he did the thing that has become legend. His ships were sitting in the harbor behind him. And as long as those ships were there, every frightened, homesick, second-guessing man in his force had an escape route, a way out, a way to say, "This is madness. I'm sailing back to Cuba." And there were men who wanted to do exactly that, loyalists to the governor who plotted to seize a ship and flee. So Cortés had the ships destroyed, stripped of anything useful, run aground, scuttled, holed beneath the waterline until they settled into the sand. The story comes down to us as he burned his boats, and whether he literally burned them or simply ran them aground and broke them, the meaning was identical, and it was unmistakable. There was no longer any way home. Think about what that does to a few hundred men. There is no retreat. There is no ship waiting. The ocean at your back is now just a wall. The only direction left is forward, inland, toward the empire, toward the floating city and the God King, and the temples running with blood. Forward or death. Cortés had taken his own men's fear and turned it into a weapon, pointed in the only direction he wanted them to go. This is the man Moctezuma was about to deal with, a man who would set fire to his own only path of escape to make sure his soldiers had no choice but to win. But the single most important thing that happened on that coast wasn't the ships, or the town, or the cannon. It was a woman. Among the gifts the local people gave to these strange newcomers, gold, food, cloth, there were also a number of enslaved women, and one of them changed the entire course of history. We know her by several names. The Spanish would baptize her and call her Doña Marina. Her own people called her Malincín. History often remembers her, with centuries of loaded meaning behind the word, as La Malinche. She was Nahua. She came from inside the Aztec world, spoke the language of the Mexica, Nahuatl, as her mother tongue. But she had been sold or given away into slavery as a girl and carried far from home, into the lands of the Maya. And so she had also learned Maya. And the Spanish, by sheer luck, happened to have with them a man named Aguilar, one of those earlier shipwreck survivors, a Spaniard who had spent years living among the Maya and now spoke their language fluently. Do you see what just clicked into place? A Spanish man could speak to a Maya speaker. Aguilar could speak Maya. Malincin could speak Maya and Nahuatl. So a sentence could now travel from Cortés in Spanish to Aguilar, who turned it into Maya, to Malincin, who turned it into Nahuatl, the language of the empire, and back again, link by link. For the first time, the strangers from the sea could talk to the empire. They could negotiate. They could lie. They could make promises and threats and alliances. They could understand the politics of the land they'd walked into, the rivalries, the hatreds, the fault lines. Without her, Cortés is deaf and mute in a foreign world. With her, he can hear everything. And she was no mere mouthpiece. Everyone who left a record of her, including the Spanish soldiers who had every reason to ignore a native woman, described her as brilliant, quick, composed, politically shrewd. She grasped the situation faster than most of the men around her. She quickly learned Spanish herself, cutting out the middleman entirely. She became Cortés's voice, his ears, his advisor, and eventually his lover. She would bear him a son. In the painted records the Mexica themselves made afterward, you can find her again and again, standing at Cortés's side, the figure through whom every word passed. Sometimes she is drawn larger than the men. The artists understood. They knew who held the real power in those rooms, the power of being the only person who understood both sides. Her story is its own tragedy, and people still argue bitterly about her. Was she a traitor who helped destroy her own world, or a slave who used the only power available to her to survive in a system that had already thrown her away? She had been sold by her own people. She owed the empire nothing. Maybe both things are true at once. Maybe that's what makes her unforgettable. But hold on to her, because she's about to walk all the way to the heart of the empire, into the throne room itself, and stand between the two most powerful men on the continent as the only person alive who can carry meaning across the gap between them. Now. Up in his palace, surrounded by his terrified priests and his failing magic, Moctezuma learned that the strangers had come ashore and were not leaving. And he made his first great mistake. The first of several. And it's the kind of mistake that only makes sense once you understand his fear. He sent gifts. He sent emissaries down to the coast loaded with treasure, gold worked into beautiful shapes, a disc of gold as big as a cartwheel representing the sun, a disc of silver for the moon, jewelry, feathered ornaments, fine cloth, all of it staggering in its craftsmanship and value. And the intent behind it, the chronicles suggest, was complicated, partly a gesture of welcome, partly a test to find out what these beings were, and partly, maybe mostly, a hope that he could give them enough to satisfy them and make them go away. Here is wealth beyond your dreams. Now please, leave. He could not have made a worse decision if he had tried. Because picture the men receiving it. A few hundred desperate adventurers, deep in debt, gambling their lives on the faint hope of riches, standing on a strange shore wondering if they'd thrown their lives away. And then messengers arrive from inland and lay before them more gold than most of them had ever seen in their lives, and tell them, in effect, this is just a small gift, and we'd be grateful if you'd take it and go. They didn't want to leave. Now they wanted to find out where the rest of it was. The gifts meant to send them away did the exact opposite. They confirmed, beyond any doubt, that everything the rumors promised was true, and more. That somewhere inland was a city dripping with gold, ruled by a king so rich he gave away the sun and the moon as a hint to go home. You could not have designed a more perfect lure. Moctezuma had reached out across the unknown to push the danger away, and instead, he'd reeled it in. And Cortés, clever, watchful Cortés, learned two things from those gifts that mattered far more than the gold itself. He learned the empire was real and impossibly wealthy. And he learned that its all-powerful God King was afraid of him. You don't send tribute to someone you're not afraid of. You don't beg a few hundred ragged strangers to please go away unless something in you has already decided they might be more than men. Moctezuma's gifts told Cortés the most valuable secret of the entire war before a single battle had been fought. The man at the top was rattled, uncertain, looking for signs, possibly wondering whether these bearded strangers were even human at all, whether they might be something out of prophecy, something returning. And a frightened opponent who can't decide what you are is an opponent you can manipulate. So Cortés did not take the gold and sail away. He had no ships to sail away in. He'd seen to that. Instead, he turned inland, toward the mountains, toward the city, toward the man who had just shown him exactly where the weak point was. The march inland is where the legend of the unstoppable conqueror starts to fall apart, and where the real, far more interesting story begins. Because Cortés did not cut his way through the empire, he talked his way in. And the first thing he did was go looking for the empire's enemies. He didn't have to look hard. Near the coast, there was a city of a people called the Totonacs, who lived under Aztec rule and resented every day of it. Their fat chief, the Spanish chroniclers with their usual mix of detail and cruelty, called him exactly that, received Cortés, and almost the moment they could understand each other through Malencin's chain of translation, began to pour out his grievances, the tribute, the endless demands, and worst of all, the tax collectors who came from the capital and took not only goods, but people, sons and daughters carried off, some of them to die on the temple steps. And Cortés listened, and then he did something audacious. While the Totonac chief was still venting, tax collectors from Moctezuma actually arrived in the city, strolling in to collect, expecting the usual fearful obedience. And Cortés, this stranger with no authority over anyone, quietly encouraged the Totonacs to do the unthinkable, to seize the emperor's own officials and throw them in cages. Imagine the terror of that. For these people, defying Moctezuma's tax collectors was like defying a force of nature. It simply was not done. The empire's power rested on the absolute certainty that resistance was suicide. And here was Cortés, persuading them to break that certainty, to lay hands on the untouchable. But then, and this is the move that reveals the whole shape of his cunning, Cortés secretly went to the imprisoned tax collectors in the night, freed 2 of them, and sent them quietly back to Moctezuma with a message. It wasn't me. I had nothing to do with this. In fact, I protected you. Tell your lord I am his friend. Do you see it? He played both sides at once. To the Totonacs, he was the liberator who'd helped them defy the empire. To Moctezuma, he was the gracious stranger who'd rescued his officials. He bound the Totonacs to him, because now they had committed an act of rebellion they could never take back, and their only protection was the bearded strangers who'd talked them into it. And at the same time, he kept Moctezuma uncertain, off balance, unsure whether this newcomer was an enemy or a friend. That is the entire war in miniature, that single maneuver. Cortés didn't conquer with steel. He conquered with the gap between what different people believed was happening. He told everyone a different story and made all the stories true at once. And so he gained his first allies. Hundreds, then thousands of Totonac warriors and porters joined the column moving inland. The army that walked toward Tenochtitlan was already, from the very start, mostly not Spanish. Keep watching that number grow, because the great myth, 500 Spaniards conquered millions, quietly erases the tens of thousands of native warriors who did the overwhelming majority of the fighting and dying. This was never really Spain versus the Aztecs. It was, in large part, the Aztec Empire's own subjects and enemies rising up, with a few hundred Spaniards as the spark, the catalyst, the strange new piece on the board that made the impossible suddenly seem possible. But the Totonacs were small. To truly threaten the empire, Cortés needed a real military power. And there was one, the one enemy the Aztecs had never managed to swallow: Tlaxcala. Tlaxcala was a confederation of city-states, fiercely independent, completely surrounded by Aztec territory, and locked in a state of more or less permanent war with the empire. They had held out for generations. They were hardened, proud, and they hated the Mexica, with a hatred refined over decades of being penned in, blockaded, denied salt and trade, and harvested for sacrifice in those ritualized wars. If anyone should have been Cortés's natural ally, it was the Tlaxcalans. They tried to kill him. This is the part people forget. When Cortés and his column entered Tlaxcalan territory, The Tlaxcalans didn't roll out a welcome. They attacked, hard, with everything they had. Because to them, these strangers had been marching arm in arm with Aztec subjects, and word had come that they'd been exchanging messages with Moctezuma. So for all Tlaxcala knew, this was some new Aztec trick, some fresh army wearing strange skins. And the fighting that followed nearly finished the Spanish then and there. The Tlaxcalans threw wave after wave of warriors at them, tens of thousands in the accounts, disciplined, ferocious, unafraid of the horses and the guns in a way the Spanish hadn't seen before. The Spaniards fought from behind their crossbows and cannon, exhausted, wounded, sleeping in their armor, watching their tiny force bleed. Men died, horses died, and the death of a horse mattered enormously, because as long as the natives believed the horse and rider were a single terrifying creature, the Spanish had a psychological weapon, and every dead horse chipped at that illusion. For days it hung in the balance. Cortés, for all his cunning, came within a hair of being overwhelmed by sheer numbers in those hills. If the Tlaxcalan leaders had committed everything, every last man, all at once, the conquest might have ended right there in a nameless valley, and you'd never have heard any of these names. But they didn't. And here's the strange, pivotal thing. The very ferocity of the Spanish resistance, a few hundred men holding off armies, the horses, the steel, the guns, the discipline, the refusal to break, convinced the Tlaxcalan leadership of something. Not that the strangers were gods. The Tlaxcalans were too clear-eyed for that, but that the strangers were useful. That a force this stubborn, this lethal, this clearly bent on marching to Tenochtitlan, was a weapon that might finally be turned against the empire that had caged them for generations. So the Tlaxcalans stopped fighting, and they made an offer. Not surrender, alliance. This was the turning point of the entire conquest, and it had almost nothing to do with the Spanish. It was a cold, strategic, decades-in-the-making decision by an enemy state to use these newcomers as the instrument of a revenge they had been dreaming of for 2 generations. Tlaxcala gave Cortés thousands of seasoned warriors, supplies, intelligence, and a secure base. The Tlaxcalans would become the backbone of the army that destroyed Tenochtitlan. They would fight in nearly every battle that followed. They would suffer staggering casualties, and they would do it not out of love for Spain, which they barely understood, but out of a burning, generational hatred for the empire across the mountains. The Aztec Empire was not brought down by foreigners. It was brought down, more than anything, by the peoples it had spent a century crushing, who finally found a lever long enough to move it. And Moctezuma, in his palace, watching the strangers gather his enemies around them like iron filings to a magnet, did nothing decisive. He kept sending messages, he kept sending gifts. He kept trying to talk them out of coming, to bribe them, to redirect them, to understand them, and every gift only confirmed his wealth, and every message only confirmed his fear. He had armies that could have met Cortés in the open, while the Spanish were still weak, still few, before Tlaxcala joined them. He never sent them. Whether out of religious dread, or political calculation, or a paralysis born of not knowing what these creatures even were, he hesitated. And hesitation, against a man like Cortés, was the same as surrender on the installment plan. There was one more city on the road, and what happened there told everyone, finally and bloodily, exactly what kind of men these strangers were. The city was Cholula, a great holy city, sacred to the feathered serpent god, crowned by an immense pyramid, to this day one of the largest pyramid structures by volume anywhere on Earth, though now it wears a church on its summit and grass on its slopes, and most people who climb it have no idea what it is. Cholula was an ally of the Aztecs, and as Cortés's army approached, Malincin, so the Spanish told it, uncovered a plot. A local woman, perhaps trying to save her, perhaps genuinely warning her, told her that the Cholulans, on Moctezuma's urging, planned to ambush the strangers inside the city, to fall on them once they were trapped within the walls. We will never know for certain whether that plot was real, whether it was exaggerated, or whether Cortés invented or inflated it because he wanted an excuse to do what he did next. The sources contradict each other, and the men who wrote them all had reasons to lie. But what is not in doubt is the result. Cortés gathered the leading men of Cholula, the nobles, the priests, the unarmed elite of the city, into an enclosed courtyard on a pretext, a farewell, a meeting. And once they were penned inside, walls on every side, the Spanish and their Tlaxcalan allies fell on them. It was a slaughter, not a battle, a massacre. Thousands killed in a few hours, trapped in the courtyards and the temple precinct with nowhere to run, cut down by steel and arrow and obsidian. The Tlaxcalans, who hated Cholula too, poured into the city behind the killing and burned and looted. The sources speak of bodies in the streets, of the sacred city's elite annihilated in an afternoon.
And then Cortés had the survivors gather, and he told them, through Melancin's voice, that the killing would stop now, that he forgave them, that they should return to their lives and accept the new order of things. That was the message. I can erase your leaders in an afternoon, and I will speak gently to you afterward as if I had done you a kindness. The terror and the mercy delivered together, deliberately, as a single tool. And word of Cholula raced ahead of the army, up into the mountains, into the floating city, onto the rooftops where Moctezuma stood watching the eastern sky. The strangers who gave away nothing of themselves, who could not be bribed or turned aside, who marched with the empire's enemies at their backs, had just wiped out the nobility of a great holy city in a single morning, and were now coming on, straight toward the heart of everything, climbing the high passes between the volcanoes, descending at last into the valley of the lake. They were almost at the gates, and Moctezuma still did not know what to do. November of 1519. The two worlds finally touch. Cortés and his column came down out of the high cold passes between the snow-capped volcanoes and saw, spread out below them in the great valley, the lake and the cities ringing it, and, at the center of everything, shining on the water, Tenochtitlan. We talked about this moment at the very beginning, the hardened soldiers who'd seen the great cities of Europe staring down at it and wondering if they were asleep. One of them, an old foot soldier named Bernal Diaz, wrote about it decades later as a withered old man, and you can still feel the awe coming off the page across 5 centuries. The towers rising from the water, the causeways crowded with people, the canoes, the gleam of it, a thing so far beyond anything in their experience that he reached for the only language he had and called it enchantment, a vision out of a tale of sorcery. And here is the cruelty of memory. He was an old man when he wrote that. By the time he set those words down, the city he was describing no longer existed. He had helped destroy it. He was writing an awestruck description of a place he had personally watched burn. He was, in a sense, writing its epitaph without quite admitting it, describing a beauty he could only see clearly after he'd helped wipe it from the earth. But on that day in November, it was alive, and it was glorious, and the strangers walked down toward it along the southern causeway, and the whole valley turned out to watch them come. And out to meet them, in a procession of staggering splendor, came Moctezuma himself. This was almost unimaginable. The God King did not go out to greet anyone. People could not look at his face. And here he was, carried out on a litter beneath a canopy of green feathers, worked with gold and silver and jade, dressed in finery that made the watching Spaniards' eyes go wide, his nobles sweeping the ground before his feet so he would not touch the bare earth. He came down off the litter and walked toward the strange, bearded foreigner, and the two men stood face to face on the causeway over the water, the living god of the 5th sun and the rogue captain who'd burned his own boats, with a captured slave woman standing between them as the only bridge across the gulf of everything they each were. What did Moctezuma say? The accounts differ, and they differ in ways that have echoed for 500 years. In the version the Spanish love to tell, Moctezuma greeted Cortés almost as a returning lord, spoke of an old prophecy, of a ruler who had departed toward the east long ago, and was destined to return and reclaim what was his, and offered up his throne and his city as if he had only ever been keeping them warm. You have come back. This was always yours. We have to handle that story very, very carefully, because it is exactly the story a conqueror would want to believe, and want everyone else to believe, that the rightful owner of the empire had simply returned,
that the conquest wasn't conquest at all, but restoration, that the God King himself had acknowledged the Spanish claim with his own mouth. It is far too convenient. Many historians now think the whole returning God framework was shaped, sharpened, maybe partly invented after the fact, by Spaniards justifying what they'd done, and by traumatized survivors trying to explain how their world could possibly have fallen, reaching for the only explanation that made the unbearable make sense. It was fated. The gods themselves had decreed it. There was nothing we could have done.
Think about how much comfort there is in that lie, for both sides.
For the Spanish, it makes the theft righteous. For the conquered, it makes the catastrophe survivable. Because a defeat written in the stars is not a defeat you have to blame yourself for. Both sides had reasons to agree that Moctezuma welcomed his own undoing, which is exactly why we should doubt it. What's more likely is something quieter and far more human. A ruler facing an unknown, dangerous force he could not read, choosing, after months of failed bribes and failed magic and failed messages, to bring them inside, into his own city, onto his own ground, where he held every advantage, where they were surrounded by water, dependent on causeways that could be cut, on bridges that could be pulled up, on an aqueduct he controlled. Maybe it wasn't surrender. Maybe it was a trap of his own. Invite the danger inside the walls, smother it with hospitality, study it, and crush it at the moment of his choosing. If that was the plan, it was not a foolish one. The Spanish were now deep inside the most defensible city imaginable, with their only routes of escape running across open water that the Mexica controlled with thousands of war canoes. From the moment they walked into Tenochtitlan, Cortés and his men were, in a very real sense, in a beautiful, gilded cage. And Cortés knew it. You can feel it in everything he did over the following days. He smiled and gave thanks and accepted the lavish quarters they were given, a great palace in the heart of the city, large enough for his whole force. He let his men marvel at the gardens and the markets and the temples. But underneath, you can sense the calculation running cold and fast. I am surrounded. I am outnumbered 1,000 to 1. I am standing on islands in the middle of a lake controlled by my host, and the moment he decides to close his hand, we are finished. I cannot win a fight here. I cannot retreat from here. So I have to do something that takes the trap and turns it inside out. And what he did was so audacious, it still stops you cold. Within days of being welcomed as an honored guest, Cortés seized Moctezuma, the emperor, the living god, in his own capital, surrounded by his own people, and made him a prisoner. Let that land. A few hundred foreigners, alone in a city of 200,000, walked into the palace of the most powerful man on the continent and took him hostage. On a pretext, there'd been a clash on the coast, Spaniards killed, and Cortés used it as his excuse, claiming Moctezuma must come and stay among them as a guarantee of his good faith. Through Malincine's voice, he pressed and threatened and cajoled, and somehow, through some combination of intimidation, the threat of immediate violence, the man's own fatal uncertainty, and that bone-deep dread that had been eating at Moctezuma for years, the emperor agreed to leave his palace and come live among the strangers. It is one of the most extraordinary gambles in all of history. And it worked. For a while. Because here is the genius of it, and the horror of it. Moctezuma was not just a ruler. He was the keystone of the entire structure. In a system that absolute, where one man's word was the will of the gods, controlling that one man meant controlling the machine. As long as Moctezuma still spoke, still gave orders, still appeared before his people, the empire kept functioning, collecting tribute, keeping order, holding back the armies that could have crushed the Spanish in an afternoon. And now every word that came out of the emperor's mouth was a word the Spanish were standing beside, watching, shaping, threatening into existence. They didn't have to conquer the empire. They just had to hold its heart in their hands and make it keep beating to their rhythm. So began one of the strangest periods in the whole story. For months, the most powerful man on the continent lived as a hostage, who was still, somehow, performing the role of emperor. He gave orders, he held court, he went hunting, under guard, he played games with Cortés. The two men, by some accounts, even developed a kind of grim familiarity, a closeness built entirely on captivity and need. Moctezuma handed over more and more treasure. The Spanish, hungry for gold, melted down centuries of irreplaceable art into plain ingots they could carry, destroying masterpieces to make bullion. He even, under pressure, formally declared himself a vassal of the distant Spanish king, words that meant little to him and everything to Cortés's legal cover back home. But underneath the performance, the city was watching, the nobles were watching, the priests were watching their god, kept like a caged bird, by foreigners who melted down the sacred and the beautiful into lumps of metal, who eyed the great temple with open disgust, who were clearly never, ever going to leave. And a pressure was building. You could feel it in the streets, in the markets, in the temple precinct. The fragile arrangement, a captive god, a few hundred trapped foreigners, a watching city, could not hold forever. Something was going to break it. What broke it came from a direction Cortés never saw coming, not from inside the city at all, from behind him, from the coast, from the sea he thought he'd closed off. Remember the governor of Cuba, Velázquez, the man whose orders Cortés had defied to sail in the first place? He had not forgotten. And while Cortés was up in the mountains playing the impossible game of holding an empire hostage with a few hundred men, word reached the governor of what his rogue captain had found: an empire, a city of gold, treasure beyond measure. And Velázquez did what powerful, slighted men do. He sent a fleet to take it all away. A much larger force than Cortés's own, around 1,000 men, more horses, more guns, under a commander named Panfilo de Narváez, with orders to arrest Cortés as a traitor and seize the conquest for the governor. So here is Cortés's nightmare. He is holding a god-king prisoner in the middle of a hostile city of 200,000, balanced on a knife's edge, when he learns that a Spanish army twice his size has landed on the coast behind him with orders to put him in chains. He is caught between the empire in front of him and his own countrymen at his back. A lesser man freezes. Cortés did the opposite. He made a decision so reckless it should have destroyed everything, and instead, it nearly doubled his strength. He split his tiny force. He left a portion of his men in Tenochtitlan to keep guarding Moctezuma and holding the city in that fragile spell, under the command of one of his captains, a man named Pedro de Alvarado. And with the rest, a small, fast-moving force, Cortés marched back down to the coast to deal with Narváez. Remember the name Alvarado. Remember that Cortés left him in charge of the most dangerous position in the world. Because Alvarado was brave, and he was loyal, and he was a gifted soldier, and he had none of Cortés's cold patience, none of his read on the politics of the room. He was the wrong man to leave holding a powder keg, and Cortés left him holding the biggest powder keg in the hemisphere. Down on the coast, Cortés pulled off another masterstroke. He didn't meet Narváez's larger army head-on, he bribed it. He sent agents ahead with gold, real gold, Aztec gold, the kind of wealth Narváez's men had crossed an ocean dreaming of, and quietly let it be known that the men who'd come to arrest him had a choice. They could fight for a governor sitting safe in Cuba, or they could join the man who'd already found the richest empire on earth and was handing out its treasure. Then he attacked at night, in a sudden storm, fast and brutal. Narváez was wounded, lost an eye in the fighting, and captured, and his 1,000 men, dazzled by gold and the promise of more, looked at the victorious Cortés and switched sides almost on the spot. He'd marched down to face an army sent to destroy him, and marched back with that army folded into his own. He now had more men, more horses, more guns than ever before. By any measure of the conquest as a contest of force, this was a triumph. But something came up the mountains with those new men, something none of them could see, something that would do more to destroy Tenochtitlan than every sword and cannon Cortés ever commanded. In Narváez's force, the chronicles tell us, there was a man carrying smallpox. Hold that. Set it gently down in the back of your mind and let it sit there, because we are going to come back to it, and when we do, it is going to change everything. For now, just know this: a disease had stepped ashore. A disease the people of this entire continent had never encountered, against which not one of the millions of people in the empire had any defense at all. It came up the mountain roads with the reinforcements, silent, invisible, riding in the breath and the blood of men who didn't even know they carried it. The deadliest weapon of the entire conquest had just begun to move inland, and nobody, not Cortés, not Moctezuma, not a single soul, had any idea. But all of that was still in the near future, because while Cortés was down on the coast turning his enemy's army into his own, back up in Tenochtitlan, Alvarado was about to make the single worst decision of the entire war. It was the season of a great religious festival, Tenochtitlan, dedicated to one of the most important gods of the Mexica. It was one of the high holy days of the year, a celebration the whole city poured itself into, and the nobles had asked Alvarado's permission to hold it, and he had granted it. The greatest warriors and dancers and singers of the city gathered in the sacred precinct, in the great walled courtyard before the main temple, unarmed in their finest ornaments, to perform the ritual dances, hundreds of them. The flower of the city's nobility, moving in the ancient patterns, drums beating, the whole thing watched by a crowd. And Alvarado, out of fear, out of suspicion that the festival was cover for an uprising, out of something darker and greedier in the accounts that say the Spanish wanted the gold the dancers wore, out of we will never fully know what, sealed the gates of the courtyard with the unarmed celebrants inside. And then his men began to kill them. It was the Cholula horror again, but worse, because these weren't enemies, these were the hosts, the people who had welcomed them, dancing in their own holy place on their own holy day. The Spanish fell on the trapped, unarmed dancers with steel. The accounts the Mexica left behind are some of the most harrowing in all of the surviving record. They describe the courtyard, the sealed exits, the dancers cut down where they stood, hands severed, bodies opened, the famous and the noble slaughtered among the drums, the desperate few trying to scale the walls and being pulled down, the blood pooling and running until, in their words, it was as if it flowed in streams. The greatest of the city's warriors and nobles, butchered in an afternoon while their weapons sat at home. And this time, there was no Cortés to deliver the cold mercy afterward. There was no clever message, no game of competing stories. There was only the raw, naked fact of it. The strangers had murdered the city's beloved at prayer. The spell broke. Whatever had held the city in its uneasy stillness, the captive emperor, the strange dread, the gifts, the games, it all shattered in that courtyard. Tenochtitlan rose, not a riot, a war. The whole city took up arms at once, a fury 200,000 people deep, and fell on the Spanish quarters. Alvarado and his men, suddenly the most hated beings on earth, barricaded themselves inside the palace with the hostage emperor and held on by their fingernails as wave after wave of enraged warriors threw themselves at the walls. The Mexica cut off their food. They cut off their water. They tore up the bridges and the causeways. Those bridges, the ones I told you to remember. The trap had finally closed. The beautiful gilded cage had become exactly that, a cage, with the door slammed shut and the whole city outside it screaming for blood. And it was into a city in open revolt, his men besieged, the careful spell of months smashed to pieces in a single bloody afternoon, that Cortés returned, triumphant from the coast, with his doubled army, with no idea that the conquest he thought he'd just secured had collapsed behind his back. He marched his enlarged force back up the causeways and into a city that had stopped pretending. The streets were ominously empty as he came in, no welcome now, no crowds, no markets, just a watching silence and the knowledge of thousands of eyes. He reached the besieged palace and joined his trapped men inside. And now, instead of a few hundred Spaniards holding an empire's heart, there were over 1,000 of them, plus their native allies, packed into a single complex in the middle of a city that wanted every one of them dead, with the bridges down and the food gone and the water cut off. He had walked his entire, newly doubled force straight into the cage and pulled the door shut behind him. And the man whose presence had once made the whole arrangement work, the captive god whose voice had kept the machine running, was about to be of no use to anyone ever again. Moctezuma died in the middle of the siege of his own palace. And how he died is one of the great unanswered questions of the whole story. A question that, depending on which answer you believe, transforms him from a coward into a victim, or from a victim into something even sadder. The Spanish version is this. With the city in full revolt and his men under relentless attack, Cortés brought Moctezuma up to the rooftop, or a high terrace of the palace, and had him appeal to his own people, to beg them to stop, to lay down their arms, to let the Spanish leave in peace. The emperor, still nominally a god, still the great speaker, stood before the furious crowd and called for calm.
And his own people stoned him. In that telling, the crowd that had once lowered their eyes rather than look at his face, now hurled stones and insults at him, struck him down, wounded him so badly that he died of his injuries a few days later. A broken man, rejected by the very people he ruled, having outlived his own divinity. They had stopped seeing a god. They saw a collaborator, a puppet speaking the stranger's words, and they answered him with stones. But the Mexica accounts tell it differently, and far more darkly. In their version, Moctezuma did not die at the hands of his own people at all. In their version, the Spanish killed him, strangled him, or stabbed him, once he was no longer useful as a bargaining chip, once his voice could no longer command the city, and then displayed his body and blamed the crowd to cover the murder. A hostage who had outlived his value, quietly disposed of, with the blame neatly pinned on his grieving subjects. We will never know which is true. The men who could tell us all had reasons to lie. But notice that both versions end in the same desolate place. Either his people killed him for becoming the stranger's instrument, or the strangers killed him because he'd served his purpose. Either way, Moctezuma, the living god, the man who held up the sky, the most powerful human being on the continent, died as a discarded thing, useful to no one, mourned by almost no one, in the ruins of the order he had spent his life embodying. The keystone of the empire, pulled out and thrown away. He had spent years watching the omens. He had felt the ending coming before anyone could name it. And in the end, he didn't even get to witness the worst of it. He died at the threshold, with the true catastrophe still ahead, which is, perhaps, the one mercy in his entire story. He never had to see what came next, because what came next was the night the Spanish almost ceased to exist. With Moctezuma dead, the Spanish had nothing left. No hostage, no leverage, no spell. They were simply over 1,000 foreigners, with their native allies, trapped in a palace in the middle of a city that wanted them annihilated, surrounded by water, with the food gone and the bridges torn out and the war canoes patrolling the canals. Every day the attacks grew worse. Every day they lost men they could not replace. The leaders of the city had chosen a new ruler now, Moctezuma's brother, a hard, clear-eyed man named Cuitlahuac, who had argued for fighting the strangers from the beginning, and who now organized the siege with a cold competence the city's defense had been lacking. There was no winning this position. There was only one question left. Could they get out alive? Cortés decided to run, at night, in secret, to slip the whole force out of the city under cover of darkness, across the shortest causeway, before the Mexica realized they were moving. It was a desperate plan, and it had one fatal problem: the bridges. The gaps in the causeway, where the war canoes could pass through, where the Mexica had pulled up the wooden spans. To cross, the Spanish built a portable bridge, a single wooden span they could lay across the first gap, march over, then pick up and carry to the next gap, and the next. The entire escape of over 1,000 people across open water depended on one movable bridge and the hope that no one would notice them leaving. And there was the gold, months of plunder, the treasure of the empire melted into ingots.
Cortés told the men to take what they needed, but warned against greed. The official share would be carried by the strongest, but the men could fill their pockets with what was left. And many of them, these treasure hunters who had crossed an ocean and burned their boats for exactly this, loaded themselves down, stuffed gold into their clothes, their packs, their armor, weighed themselves down with the wealth they'd come for, on a night when their lives would depend on speed and on the ability to swim. Remember that, the gold and the water and the men who would not let go of one to survive the other. They moved out in the dead of night, in the rain, in silence. The long column snaking out of the palace and onto the causeway with their one bridge and their hostages and their gold and their fear. And for a few minutes, it almost worked. The dark and the rain held. The first gap was bridged and crossed. And then a sentry saw them. A woman drawing water, in some accounts, who raised the alarm. The drums on the great temple began to beat, that deep, carrying war drum that could be heard across the whole valley. And the city woke up and understood, all at once, that its enemies were trying to slip away in the night. What followed is remembered as La Noche Triste, the night of sorrows, the sad night. And it was a catastrophe so complete that it nearly ended the conquest then and there. The canals filled with war canoes. Warriors poured onto the causeway from both ends, attacking the strung-out column in the dark and the rain, where the Spanish guns and horses and crossbows, their whole advantage, were nearly useless. You can't form ranks on a narrow causeway in the dark. You can't charge cavalry through a press of bodies on a road 2 arm spans wide with water on both sides. The Mexica struck from the canoes, from the water, from the dark, dragging men off the causeway, capturing as many as they could alive, because remember, capture meant the temple, and there were scores to settle on those steps now. The portable bridge jammed under the weight of bodies in panic and could not be pulled free. And so the gaps in the causeway, the open channels of water, became death. The column piled up at the breaks with no way across, and in the crush, men fell into the water, or jumped, trying to reach the far side, and the gold dragged them down. This is the image that haunts the whole story. Men who had crossed an ocean for treasure, who had refused to leave it behind, sinking into the black water of the lake under the weight of the very gold they'd come to find. Some of them, the accounts say, drowned in the gaps in such numbers that those behind crossed over the dead, that the channel filled with bodies and baggage and horses until it could be walked across like solid ground. The gold that was supposed to be the reward for everything became the thing that pulled them under and held them there. By the time the survivors clawed their way to the mainland at the far end of the causeway, the army had been gutted. We don't have exact numbers, and the sources disagree, but the losses were staggering. A great portion of the Spanish force dead or captured, along with enormous numbers of their Tlaxcalan allies, much of the gold gone to the bottom of the lake, the artillery lost, horses lost, the entire enterprise bleeding out on a causeway in the rain. There's a story, maybe true, maybe legend, the kind a defeated army tells about itself afterward, that Cortés, having fought his way to the mainland, stopped beneath a great tree on the shore, looked back at the city across the water where so many of his men were dead or being dragged toward the temple steps, and wept. The tree of the sad night. Whether he wept or not, the meaning is real. This was the moment the conquest came closest to dying. A shattered, exhausted remnant of an army, soaked and bleeding on the shore of a lake, having just been driven out of the city in the worst defeat of the entire campaign, with the most powerful empire on the continent now fully awake, fully unified against them, and out for their blood. By every reasonable measure, it was over. They had lost. They should have run for the coast and never come back. And the captured Spaniards, the ones dragged off the causeway alive, were taken to the great temple in the days that followed, up the steps, in full view of their comrades who could do nothing but watch from a distance, and offered to the gods on the stone at the summit, one after another, while the drums beat over the city that had survived. The Mexica had won. They had thrown the invaders out of their city in a single bloody night. The strangers were broken, running, finished. That's what it looked like. That's what everyone believed. They were wrong. And the reason they were wrong had nothing to do with the swords, or the horses, or even Cortés. The reason they were wrong was already loose in the city, invisible, patient, riding in the breath of the people, and it was about to do what no army on earth could have done. The shattered remnant of Cortez's force did not get to limp away in peace. The empire came after them. As they retreated, exhausted and starving, trying to reach the safety of Tlaxcala, the Mexica gathered a great army to finish them off in the open, to catch them on a plain where there were no causeways, no narrow roads, just numbers, and end the invasion for good. They met on the plain of Otumba, and by every rule of war, the Spanish should have died there. They were outnumbered beyond counting, wounded, demoralized, low on powder, many of them on foot now with the horses dead. The Mexica army surrounded them and began to grind them down. And then Cortés saw something. Out among the enemy ranks, carried high, was the great battle standard of the Mexica commander, an enormous ornament of feathers and gold rising above the army. And Cortés understood, in that instant, something fundamental about how this enemy fought. Their armies were held together by the standard and the man who carried it. The standard was the army's nervous system. Cut it down, and the whole organized mass might lose its head. So with the last of his cavalry, the few mounted men he had left, Cortés put his head down and charged. Not at the mass of the army, but straight through it. A spear aimed at one man, the standard bearer, the commander himself. It was insane. It was a single, desperate lance thrust at the one point that might matter. And it worked. The Spanish riders cut through to the commander and killed him, and the great standard fell, and the Mexica army, seeing its head struck off, broke. The cohesion dissolved. The encircling host that had been about to annihilate the Spanish suddenly came apart, and the battered survivors fought their way clear. It's a stunning moment, and it gets told as a triumph of Spanish nerve, and it was. But notice what it also reveals: how close to total annihilation they remained, how the entire future of the conquest hung, again, on a single throw of the dice, a single lucky lance. There was nothing inevitable about any of this. Strip away one lucky charge, one missed sentry, one different decision, and the whole story ends with a few hundred dead foreigners and a city that endures. They reached Tlaxcala, and here came one of the most important moments of the entire war, and it was a moment of pure politics, not battle, because Cortés arrived in Tlaxcala beaten, half his men dead, his treasure at the bottom of the lake, his aura of invincibility shattered. He came to his allies as a loser, and the Tlaxcalans had every reason now to cut their losses, to hand the broken strangers over to the Mexica and make peace with the empire, or simply to finish the foreigners themselves and take whatever was left. There was a faction in Tlaxcala that argued for exactly that: abandon these doomed men. But the leaders of Tlaxcala made a different choice. They doubled down. They had hated the empire for generations. They had finally found, in these strangers, a weapon unlike anything they'd ever had, a thing that had walked into Tenochtitlan and held it hostage, a thing the Mexica genuinely feared. The strangers were down, yes, but they were not the real prize. The prize was the destruction of the empire, and the Tlaxcalans calculated, coldly and correctly, that with the strangers as their spearhead, they had a better chance of breaking Tenochtitlan than they would ever have alone. So they took the survivors in, they sheltered them, fed them, healed them, and began, slowly over months, to help them rebuild. The alliance held, and that decision, made by Tlaxcalan lords in a council will never fully reconstruct, mattered far more to the fall of the empire than any Spanish sword. The conquest survived the Night of Sorrows because the empire's own enemies decided it should. But while the Spanish licked their wounds in Tlaxcala and the empire celebrated its great victory, the real conqueror was already moving through Tenochtitlan, and it asked permission from no one. The smallpox had arrived. We left it with that one infected man who came up the mountains in Narvaez's army. Now follow what it did. The peoples of the Americas had been separated from the rest of humanity for thousands of years. In that time, the people of Europe, Asia, and Africa had been living packed together with domesticated animals, cattle, pigs, chickens, in crowded cities, trading germs back and forth across continents for millennia, and a brutal evolutionary bargain had been struck. Wave after wave of plague had swept through those populations, killing the vulnerable and leaving behind survivors whose descendants carried at least some resistance to a whole arsenal of diseases. Smallpox, measles, influenza, typhus, these were the grim, ancient companions of the Old World. The Americas had almost none of it. Fewer herd animals to catch diseases from, total isolation from the Old World's plague pools. The people of Tenochtitlan, of the whole empire, of the entire hemisphere, walked through life with immune systems that had simply never met these things and had no idea how to fight them. And so when smallpox stepped off the boat and walked up into the highlands, it walked into a population with no defenses whatsoever. Not weak defenses. None. It was as if the entire continent had been left unlocked. What happened next is one of the worst things that has ever happened to human beings, and it happened almost entirely out of sight, with no battle, no army, no enemy you could see or fight or hate. The disease swept through Tenochtitlan in the months after the Night of Sorrows, and the Mexica accounts of it are unbearable to read. They describe a sickness no one had ever seen, pustules that covered the whole body, every part of it, the face, the chest, the limbs, so thick and so painful that the sick could not move, could not lie on their backs or their fronts or their sides, could not turn over without screaming. They describe people unable to walk, unable to rise to find food or water, lying helpless in their homes. They describe whole households dying together, no one left well enough to care for the sick dying not only of the disease, but of hunger and thirst, because there was no one left standing to bring them water. They describe the dead too numerous to bury, houses pulled down over the bodies because there was no one to carry them out. And the cruelty of the timing is almost beyond belief. This was not a slow famine that gives people time to prepare. This was sudden, total, and it struck the city at the exact moment it needed every ounce of its strength. It killed the strong and the weak alike, the warriors who would have to defend the causeways, the farmers who grew the food, the leaders who organized the defense, the priests, the children, the old. It struck without mercy and without pattern, and the Mexica had no framework to even understand it. There was no enemy to fight. There was no offering that stopped it. Their gods, the gods they had fed with rivers of blood precisely to keep catastrophe at bay, were silent. And among the dead was the emperor, Cuitlahuac, Moctezuma's brother, the hard and competent ruler who had organized the defeat of the Spanish on the Night of Sorrows, the one man who had stood up to the strangers from the start and beaten them, caught the disease and died after a reign of only about 80 days. The empire had found, at the last possible moment, exactly the leader it needed: decisive, unsentimental, militarily gifted, the man who'd already proven he could beat the invaders. And the invisible thing the invaders carried killed him before he could finish the job. Think about the asymmetry of that. The Spanish lost men to smallpox too, but far fewer, because most of them carried at least some resistance from a lifetime in the Old World. The disease tore through the Mexica and largely spared their enemies. To the people of the empire, watching their families die in agony while the bearded strangers walked among the same sickness and mostly lived, what could it possibly mean? It looked like proof. Proof that the strangers' god was stronger. Proof that the world had turned against the Mexica. Proof that the prophecies had been right, that the fifth sun was ending, that everything they had built and bled for was being unmade by a power they could not see, could not name, and could not resist. This is the part of the story we have to sit with, because it is the truest answer to the question we started with. How does an empire of millions fall to a few hundred men? The answer is that it didn't, really. The few hundred men were the spark, and the catalyst, and the spearhead, and the empire's own enemies provided the army. But the thing that actually broke the back of the Mexica, that emptied the city, that killed its leaders, that shattered its will and its workforce and its warriors, was a disease that no one chose, that no one aimed, that simply arrived because two worlds that had been apart for 10,000 years finally touched, and one of them was carrying death in its lungs without even knowing it. There is a kind of horror in that, even deeper than the horror of the massacres. The massacres were chosen. They had a hand behind the blade, a mind you could condemn. The plague had nothing. It was just biology, just the blind arithmetic of immunity, doing in months what no army could have done in years. The Mexica had organized their entire civilization around the fear that the world would end, and the belief that they could hold the ending back through blood and ritual and will. And the world ended anyway, through a mechanism so far outside their understanding that they could only experience it as a curse from the heavens. By the time Cortés finished rebuilding his strength in Tlaxcala and turned back toward the lake, the city he was marching against was no longer the city that had thrown him out in the night. It was a wounded thing, grieving, depopulated. Its greatest leader, dead of a sickness no one understood, its warriors thinned, its families shattered, its faith in its own gods quietly bleeding away. But it was not yet beaten. It still had a king, a young one, the last one, and he was not going to surrender his city to anyone. His name was Cuauhtémoc, and his story is the last and the hardest part of all of this. Cuauhtémoc was young, in his 20s, when the dying empire turned to him. He was related to the royal line, married into it, a warrior, and by every account, he had something his immediate predecessors had lacked in their final hours: an absolute, unbending refusal to bend. Where Moctezuma had hesitated and negotiated and tried to understand the strangers, Cuauhtémoc had no illusions left to lose. He had seen the massacre at the temple, the captive god, the gold melted into bars, the plague in the streets. He knew exactly what the strangers were and exactly what they intended. And he decided that the city would fight to the end rather than hand itself over. He prepared for the war he knew was coming. He strengthened the defenses. He tried to rebuild the alliances, to call in the empire's tributary cities, to remind them that whatever they thought of Tenochtitlan, the strangers were worse and were coming for everyone. He executed those he thought were collaborating with the enemy. He readied the war canoes, the warriors, the causeways. He was, in the time he had, everything a leader of a doomed cause could be: clear-eyed, resolute, and unbroken. But the empire was crumbling beneath him faster than he could hold it together, and not by the sword. Because while Cuauhtémoc rallied Tenochtitlan, the plague and the politics were emptying his empire out from under him. City after city that had once paid tribute to the Mexica now looked at the situation and made a cold calculation. The empire was wounded, possibly dying. The strangers were ascendant, backed by Tlaxcala and growing stronger every month. And a century of resentment finally tipped over into open defection. One subject city after another sent envoys to Cortés, joined the alliance against the capital, brought their warriors, their food, their canoes, their knowledge of the lake. By the time the noose finally closed, the army marching on Tenochtitlan was enormous and overwhelmingly indigenous. Tens of thousands, by most estimates, of Tlaxcalans and Texcocans and warriors from dozens of cities that had decided the empire's hour had come. The few hundred Spanish, with their dwindling horses and their guns, were a hard, sharp point on the end of a vast native spear. This was the empire's own world rising up to tear it down, with the foreigners as the catalyst that made the unthinkable suddenly possible. Tenochtitlan, the city that had dominated this valley for 100 years, the city that had fed its son on the blood of these very peoples, now stood almost completely alone, surrounded by the accumulated fury of everyone it had ever conquered. But it was still an island, still a fortress in the middle of a lake, and the Spanish had learned, on the Night of Sorrows, the terrible price of fighting on the causeways, where the war canoes ruled the water and the narrow roads turned every battle into a slaughter. Cortés knew he could not simply march in again. He had tried that. It had nearly killed him. So he did something that I think is the single most coldly brilliant decision of the entire war. And it shows you that beneath all the luck and the lies, the man was a genuine military mind. He decided to take the lake. The Mexica's great advantage was the water, the canoes, the canals, the open lake that turned the city into a fortress, and the causeways into death traps. So Cortés decided to build a navy on a lake, in the middle of a continent, hundreds of miles from any sea. He had 13 ships built, brigantines, sailing vessels with oars and sails and platforms for cannon. But here is the staggering part. He had them built in pieces, in Tlaxcala, up in the mountains, far from the lake. The timbers cut and shaped, the planks fitted, the rigging and the ironwork prepared, much of it salvaged from the very ships he'd scuttled on the coast at the very beginning, the iron and the sails and the fittings carried inland for this.
And then he had the disassembled ships, thousands of pieces, carried over the mountains to the lake on the backs of thousands of porters, a column of human beings hauling an entire fleet across the high passes, plank by plank, nail by nail. Imagine that procession. Thousands of people carrying a navy across a mountain range. The keels, the masts, the planking, the iron, strung out along the trails for miles, climbing toward the valley of the lake. It is one of the most extraordinary logistical feats in the history of warfare, and almost no one has ever heard of it. An entire fleet, carried in pieces over the mountains by hand, and then reassembled on the shore of the lake, ready to do to the war canoes what the war canoes had done to the Spanish on the causeway. When those 13 ships were launched onto the lake, the entire balance of the war flipped. The canoes that had ruled the water, that had massacred the Spanish in the night, were suddenly facing sailing ships armed with cannon, ships that could ram them, outrun them, blast them apart from a distance the canoes could never answer. The lake, the city's great shield, became the avenue of its destruction. The brigantines could now control the water, cut off the causeways, support attacks from the flanks, and, most importantly, sever the city from the mainland completely. They could enforce a blockade. And a blockade was the real weapon. Because remember what I told you to remember, all the way back at the beginning, when we first walked into the living city, the aqueduct. Tenochtitlan, the great city on the water, could not drink the water it sat in. The lake was brackish. The city's fresh water came from springs on the mainland, carried in along a stone aqueduct from the heights of Chapultepec. A city of hundreds of thousands of people drinking from a thin stone channel. One of the first things Cortés did when the siege began in earnest was cut it. He sent men to break the aqueduct, to sever the fresh water at its source. And in that single act, he condemned the city. Because now Tenochtitlan, packed with people, swollen with refugees who had fled the surrounding towns, ravaged by disease, surrounded by enemies on every causeway and ships on every stretch of water, now that city had no fresh water. None. The most beautiful city in the world, the city built on water, gardens floating on the lake, was about to die of thirst. This is the shape of the ending now. Not a glorious battle, not a clash of armies on an open field, a slow strangulation, a blockade tightening week by week around an island city full of starving, thirsty, dying people, defended by a young king who would not surrender, attacked from the water by ships carried over mountains, and from the land by the assembled hatred of an entire conquered world. The siege of Tenochtitlan would last about 3 months, and it would be one of the longest, most desperate, most horrifying sieges in human history. The people inside that city did not break easily. They did not surrender when the water was cut. They did not surrender when the food ran out. They did not surrender when the disease came back, when the bodies piled in the streets, when the children began to die. They fought, street by street, canal by canal, house by house, with a courage that even their enemies recorded in tones close to awe. And we have to give them that. Whatever you think of the empire, and there is a great deal to condemn in it, the conquests, the tribute, the temple steps running red, the people who defended Tenochtitlan in the summer of 1521 did something almost beyond comprehension. They held a doomed city against the world. They had been abandoned by their allies, betrayed by their tributaries, gutted by a plague they couldn't understand, cut off from food and water, attacked by ships they had no answer for, outnumbered by a coalition of every people they had ever wronged. And they kept fighting. For weeks, for months. Because their king would not yield, and because somewhere in them was the belief that they were the people of the sun, the chosen ones who had risen from a swamp to rule the world, and that surrender was a kind of death worse than dying. They were wrong about almost everything they believed, but they were not cowards. History should at least grant them that.
The siege settled into a rhythm of horror. Each day the brigantines patrolled the lake and shelled the city. Each day, columns of Spanish and their tens of thousands of native allies pushed up the causeways toward the city, fighting through barricades, across the gaps where the bridges had been torn out, into the maze of canals and rooftops where every house was a fortress and every canal a kill zone. And each evening, more often than not, the attackers fell back. Because this was the lesson Cortés had learned in blood, that pushing into the city was easy in the morning and lethal by afternoon. The Mexica would let the columns advance, draw them deep into the streets, and then counterattack from the rooftops and the canals, from the canoes that slipped through the waterways, cutting the attackers off, hemming them in, dragging them down. Every day the besiegers gained ground, and every evening, exhausted and bleeding, they gave most of it back. The city would not fall in a day. It would not fall in a week. It had to be ground down, building by building, and every building cost lives. So Cortés changed the method. If the city's strength was the water and the canals and the rooftops, then he would destroy the city itself. As his forces took each section, he had them tear it down, level the buildings, fill in the canals with the rubble, demolish the rooftops the defenders fought from, turn the intricate three-dimensional water fortress into flat, open, defensible ground that his cannon and his allies could hold. He was unmaking the city as he took it, raising the most beautiful city in the world block by block, pushing the debris into the canals that had been its veins, so that what he conquered each day could not be lost again each night. Think about what that means. He was not capturing Tenochtitlan, he was erasing it. The conquest of the city and the destruction of the city were the same act. To win it, he had to make it cease to exist. The towers that had stunned his men into silence from the mountain pass, the floating gardens, the temples, the palaces, the markets, all of it fed into the canals as rubble day after day, as the line of ruin crept inward toward the last stand of the defender. And in the middle of all this, on one terrible afternoon, the besiegers nearly lost everything. It was during one of the great assaults. The Spanish and their allies had pushed deep into the city, too deep, too fast, in a coordinated attack across several causeways at once. And Cuauhtémoc's warriors did exactly what they had done so many times. They let the attackers overextend, then sprang the trap, cutting them off in the heart of the city, hemming the columns in among the canals. The attack collapsed into a rout, and in the chaos, the Mexica did what they had always fought to do. They took captives, alive. A large number of Spanish soldiers, dragged out of the press, bound and carried off toward the great temple. And then the besiegers, the Spanish and their thousands of allies, pulled back to the causeways and the safer ground, had to watch. Because the great temple rose above the whole city, you could see its summit from everywhere on the lake. And the Mexica took the captured Spaniards up the steps, in full view of their comrades, who could do nothing, who were too far to reach them, and too few to fight back through. The drums began, that deep, carrying drum that meant the offering had begun. And one by one, the captured soldiers were taken to the stone at the top, and the rite was performed. The heart lifted toward the sun, the body sent rolling back down the steps, while the men who had marched beside them that morning watched from across the water, close enough to recognize them, too far to save a single one. The accounts of the men who survived to write about it never quite recover from describing this. The helplessness of it, the sound of the drums carrying across the lake, watching friends climb those steps. It was psychological warfare of the most devastating kind, and it nearly worked. Because the native allies, the tens of thousands of Tlaxcalans and others who were doing most of the fighting and dying, saw this too, and among them, a current of fear and doubt ran through the camps. The Mexica priests, the chronicles say, called out across the lines a prophecy, that the gods had promised the strangers and all who followed them would be destroyed within a handful of days, that the offerings on the temple were the proof of the turning tide. And for a few days, it held. Many of the allies, shaken, withdrew from the fight, waiting to see whether the prophecy would come true, whether the gods would indeed wipe out the invaders within the promised days. The whole vast coalition wavered. The siege very nearly came apart from the inside. not from defeat in battle, but from terror and belief. But the days passed, and the gods did not come, and the strangers and their core of allies were still there. And when the prophesied destruction failed to arrive, the wavering allies came back, and the noose tightened again, harder than before, because now the defenders' last great psychological weapon had been spent and had failed. That was the turning point of the siege. Not a battle, a prophecy that didn't come true. The defenders had staked their enemies' morale on the gods delivering a miracle by a certain day, and when the day passed in silence, something broke, not in the attackers, but in the long, fading hope of the defenders. They had played their highest card, the heavens had stayed shut, and after that, there was only the slow arithmetic of starvation. The city was sealed. No food came in, no water. The fresh water had been cut at the aqueduct weeks before, and the people had been reduced to digging for brackish seepage, drinking water that was salt and filth, water that sickened them. The food was gone. The accounts, both Spanish and Mexica, describe what a city looks like when it starves to death by the tens of thousands. People ate whatever they could find: lizards, insects, the bark of trees, grasses from the lake, leather, the corn stalks, dirt. The chronicles describe people so wasted by hunger that they barely resembled the living. They described the dead lying in the streets and the houses because there was no one with the strength to move them and nowhere to take them. They described the smell of the city carrying out across the water to the besiegers who could smell the dying before they reached it. And still, Cuauhtémoc would not surrender. Cortés sent offers, repeatedly. He sent captured nobles back into the city with terms, with promises that the people would be spared if they laid down their arms, that the young king would be treated with honor. And again, the answer came back: no. They would not yield. The accounts describe Mexica warriors, skeletal with hunger, barely able to stand, still coming to the barricades to fight, still refusing the offers, still saying that they would die in their city rather than hand it over. There is something in that refusal that is hard to look at directly. Was it courage? Pride? Despair? The certainty that surrender meant slavery and the temple and the loss of everything, so that fighting was simply the less unbearable death? Probably all of it at once. But the result was that the ending, when it came not as a negotiated surrender that might have saved tens of thousands of lives, but as a final, total collapse. A city fought down to its last few square blocks, packed with the starving and the dying and the few thousand who could still lift a weapon, pressed back into the last corner of the last district, while the brigantines closed in from the water and the allies closed in from the rubble. By the end, the besiegers were not really fighting an army anymore. They were advancing into a charnel house. The men who took the last sections of the city wrote about wading through the dead, about a silence in some quarters broken only by the moans of the dying, about the unbearable stench, about stepping over bodies to reach the few defenders who still stood. Some of the hardened soldiers who had crossed an ocean for gold, who had seen the massacres and the temple and the night of sorrows, wrote that they had never seen anything like the last days inside Tenochtitlan, that it was the worst thing they had ever witnessed, and that the memory of it never left them. This was the city Bernal Diaz remembered as enchantment. This is what it had become. And the same men who'd gasped at its beauty from the mountain pass were now the ones picking their way through its corpses toward the final surrender. They had gotten exactly what they came for, and what they came for was this. It ended on a day in August of 1521. By then, the defenders had been pressed into the northern district of the city, into Tlatelolco, the place where that vast, dazzling market had once stood. The market the Spanish had described with such wonder, where tens of thousands had once moved through ordered rows of gold and feathers and chocolate and flowers. Now, that same ground was the last redoubt of a dying people, crammed with refugees and the starving, and the few thousand warriors still able to fight, backed up against the water with nowhere left to go. The final assault came from every direction at once. The brigantines pushed in from the lake. The land columns drove in across the rubble of the city they had already destroyed. And the defenders, skeletal, exhausted, out of food and water and hope, made their last stand in the ruins of their own marketplace. There was almost nothing left to take. The fighting in those final hours was less a battle than a collapse, the last lines breaking, the survivors scattering toward the water, toward the canoes, toward any direction that wasn't death, while the attackers poured in behind them. The accounts describe the people fleeing onto the rooftops and into the few remaining canals, the warriors fighting to cover the escape of the others, the whole thing dissolving into a final, desperate flight across the water. And Cuauhtémoc, the young king who would not surrender, tried to escape. He got into a canoe with a small group, his family, his closest people, and tried to slip across the lake and out of the trap, to reach the mainland, to keep fighting, to keep the idea of the empire alive even after the city was gone. One of the brigantines caught him. A Spanish ship overtook the canoe on the water, and the young emperor, the last great speaker of the Mexica, was taken. The accounts say that when he was brought before Cortés, he did not beg. He carried himself, even in defeat, even captured, with the bearing of a king. There's a moment recorded, perhaps polished in the retelling, the way these moments always are, but it has the ring of something real, where Cuauhtémoc, standing before the conqueror, is said to have reached toward the dagger at Cortés's belt and asked to be killed. To have said, in effect, "I did everything I could to defend my city and my people. I have failed. I have nothing left. Strike now and end it."
He was not killed then. That would have been a mercy, and mercy was not what was coming. But in that moment, the captured king asking for the blade, refusing to plead, you can feel the entire tragedy compressed into a single gesture. He had inherited a dying empire and fought for it past all reason, past all hope. And now it was over, and the only dignity left to him was the manner in which he lost. With the king taken, the resistance ended. There was no one left to give the order to fight, and nothing left to fight for. The remaining people, those who could still move, streamed out of the ruined city in the days that followed. The Mexica accounts describe this exodus in heartbreaking detail. The starving survivors, filthy, ragged, hollowed out by months of siege and famine and disease, walking out across the causeways past the lines of their enemies, the women, the children, the old, the wounded, leaving the corpse of the greatest city in the Americas behind them. Many of them were robbed, abused, enslaved, or killed as they fled. The conquering allies took their revenge for a century of grievances. It was not orderly. It was not merciful. It was the end of a world, and it looked like one. And then there was silence. This is the detail that stays with me more than almost any other. Tenochtitlan had been one of the loudest places on earth, a city of hundreds of thousands. The drums and the conch shells and the cries of the market and the chants from the temples, the constant living roar of the densest human settlement in the hemisphere. And after the surrender, the survivors and the conquerors alike remembered the quiet. The drums had stopped. The market was rubble. The temples were broken. The canals were choked with the dead and the debris of the demolished city. Where there had been the endless noise of 200,000 lives, there was the lap of water against ruin, and the wind, and the smell. The Mexica remembered that it rained that night, a soft rain falling on the ruins, as if even the sky, they said, was weeping over what had been lost. How many died? We will never know with any precision. The numbers given in the sources are enormous and unreliable, shaped by trauma and propaganda and the simple impossibility of counting the uncountable. But the scale of death in that siege, from the fighting, from the famine, from the thirst, from the disease that had returned to feast on a starving population, was almost beyond comprehension. Tens upon tens of thousands, possibly more than 100,000 within the city alone over the course of those months. A great city reduced, in the space of a single summer, to a graveyard. The empire that had ruled this valley for 100 years, that had drawn tribute from coast to coast, that had fed its son on the blood of its enemies precisely to keep its world from ending, that empire was finished,
Its capital was rubble. Its god-king was dead. Its last king a prisoner. Its people scattered and enslaved and dying. Its gods proven powerless. Its world over.
And the fifth sun, which they had given so much blood to preserve, kept right on rising, indifferent.
The thing they had feared, the ending of everything, had come, and the sun did not stop, and the sky did not fall, and the universe did not freeze into darkness. The world went on without them, which is, in a way, the most devastating possibility of all. Not that the world ended, but that their world ended, and the world didn't even notice. And here is where the story curdles into something almost unbearably bleak. Because the men who had done all of this, who had crossed an ocean, burned their boats, marched through the mountains, held a god-king hostage, survived the night of sorrows, carried a navy over the mountains, and ground a great city to rubble over 3 months of siege, had done it all for one thing: gold. And when they finally took the city, the gold was not there. Oh, there was treasure, but nothing like what they had dreamed of, nothing like what their imaginations had built over 2 years of bloodshed. Where was the rest? Where was the wealth they'd seen in Moctezuma's gifts, the hoards they'd been promised, the riches that had drowned so many of their comrades on the causeway? Some of it was at the bottom of the lake, lost forever in the gaps of the causeway on the night of sorrows. Some of it had been hidden by the Mexica, thrown into the lake, buried, scattered, deliberately denied to the enemy. Some of it had simply never existed in the quantities the Spanish fever dreamed. The conquerors stood in the ruins of the richest city they had ever seen, having destroyed it utterly to possess it, and found that the prize they had murdered a civilization for had slipped through their fingers. And the soldiers, who had been promised wealth, who had bled and watched their friends climb the temple steps, were furious. They wanted their gold. They had earned it, as they saw it, in blood. So they turned to the one person who might know where it was, the captured king. They tortured Cuauhtémoc, the young emperor who had defended his city to the last and asked only to be killed cleanly. They bound him and burned the soles of his feet with oil, along with another noble lord, trying to force him to reveal where the empire's treasure was hidden. There's a famous moment in the accounts, again, perhaps polished, but rooted in something real. The other lord being tortured beside him cried out in his agony, and Cuauhtémoc is said to have looked at him and asked, with terrible composure, whether he, Cuauhtémoc, was lying on a bed of pleasure, as if to say, "Do you think this is easy for me? Do you think I am resting comfortably? Endure it." He gave them little. Maybe because there was little to give, because the gold really was at the bottom of the lake and scattered to the winds. The conqueror, Cortés, eventually stopped the torture, possibly out of some calculation, possibly because he realized the king genuinely couldn't lead them to a horde that no longer existed. But the image remains: the last king of the Mexica, crippled, his feet ruined, kept alive as a humiliated prisoner, dragged around as a symbol of the conquest, useful now only as a trophy. And his end, when it finally came a few years later, was even more squalid. Cortés, paranoid and never able to fully trust the captured king he kept dragging along on his expeditions, took Cuauhtémoc on a long, grueling march into the jungles of the south, toward Honduras, on a venture that accomplished little. And somewhere in that jungle, on the suspicion, perhaps real, perhaps invented, that the king was plotting against him, Cortés had Cuauhtémoc executed. Hanged from a tree in the wilderness, far from his ruined city, far from his lake, far from everything he had been born to rule. The last great speaker of the Mexica died swinging from a branch in a foreign jungle, on the word of the man who had destroyed his world. He was, by most reckonings, still in his 20s. He has become, over the centuries, a symbol, a figure of resistance and dignity in tragedy, far more beloved in memory than the hesitant Moctezuma ever was. But in life, his reward for refusing to break was a slow, humiliating death in the dark, far from home. And the city itself? They did not abandon it. That might almost have been kinder, to let the ruins sink back into the lake, to let the reeds and the water reclaim it. Instead, the conquerors did something that I think reveals the deepest cruelty of the whole enterprise, deeper than the massacres, deeper even than the torture. They built their own city directly on top of it. Cortés decided that the capital of the new Spanish dominion would rise on the exact site of Tenochtitlan, on the bones of the city they had just destroyed. They cleared the rubble, drained and filled the canals, and built a Spanish city, Mexico City, right there, using the very stones of the broken temples and palaces as building material. The Great Pyramid, the Templo Mayor, the towering heart of the Mexica world, the place where the captives had climbed and the hearts had been lifted to the sun. They tore it down to its foundations and used its stones, and on or beside that sacred ground they raised a cathedral, a Christian cathedral, built partly from the carved stones of the temple it replaced. Think about what that does. It is not just conquest, it is erasure. It is the deliberate physical overwriting of one world by another. They didn't just defeat the Mexica, they built their new order on top of the old one so completely that for centuries, the city beneath was almost entirely forgotten, paved over, built over, lost. People walked the streets of a great colonial capital with no real sense of the drowned and buried city of stone and water beneath their feet. The Templo Mayor itself was so thoroughly erased that its exact location was uncertain for generations, until workers laying electrical cables in the 20th century, digging in the heart of modern Mexico City, struck something in the ground, a great carved stone, and realized they were standing on top of the buried heart of Tenochtitlan all along.
It had been there the whole time, underneath, waiting.
The way I told you, at the very beginning, that you could stand on the ground where it stood and feel nothing but concrete and traffic. Now you know what's underneath. Now you know what we built our world on top of. And it wasn't only the stones they erased. It was the memory, the knowledge. The Mexica and the other peoples of the valley had books, codices, painted manuscripts, screen folds of bark paper and deerskin, recording their history, their gods, their calendars, their astronomy, their genealogies, their accumulated understanding of the world. Centuries of recorded thought, a library of a civilization. The conquerors and the priests who came after them burned them. Not all, but the overwhelming majority. Bonfires of books, condemned as the work of the devil. The painted records of a pagan world consigned to the flames as a matter of religious duty. We have today only a handful of pre-conquest manuscripts from this entire civilization, a tiny, scorched remnant of what once existed, an entire way of understanding the universe reduced to ash on the orders of men who believed they were saving souls. So when we ask how much was lost, it is not only the people, though the people were lost in numbers that stagger the mind. It is the knowledge, the astronomy, the medicine, the poetry, the philosophy, the way of seeing the world that took thousands of years to build and was unmade in a generation. We don't even know the full shape of what we lost, because the records that would have told us were the first things to burn. We are missing not just the answers, but most of the questions. There are things those people understood that no living person knows, and no living person ever will, because the books are ash and the minds that held them are dust. But the fall of the city was not the end of the dying. In some ways, it was barely the beginning, because the smallpox that had emptied Tenochtitlan during the siege was only the first wave. Over the decades that followed the conquest, wave after wave of old world disease rolled across the land, smallpox again, and then measles, and typhus, and influenza, and others, sometimes alone, sometimes layered one on top of another before a population could even begin to recover from the last. And each wave fell on people who had no resistance, and each wave killed in numbers that are almost impossible to hold in the mind. The estimates vary, and historians argue fiercely about the exact figures, because we are reconstructing them from fragmentary records and educated guesswork. But the broad shape is not really in dispute, and the broad shape is one of the greatest demographic catastrophes in the entire history of our species. Central Mexico, on the eve of the conquest, may have held something on the order of 15 to 25 million people, one of the most densely populated regions on Earth. Within about a century, that population had collapsed to perhaps a million or two, reductions of 90%. In some areas, more. Let that number sit. 9 out of 10. Not in a battle, not in the siege. Across the generations that followed, through disease and dislocation and forced labor and the simple shattering of a society's ability to feed and sustain itself. 9 out of 10 human beings gone. Whole regions emptied. Villages that had stood for centuries falling silent. A landscape that had teemed with life becoming, in the span of a few generations, a landscape of survivors and ghosts. This is the part of the story that should change how you understand the entire conquest and the entire encounter between the two halves of the world. Because the swords and the cannon and the horses and the brilliant, treacherous strategy of Cortés, all of it, in the end, was almost a footnote next to the microbes. The single most consequential thing the Europeans brought to the Americas was not steel or gunpowder or the cross. It was the invisible cargo in their blood and their breath, the accumulated diseases of the Old World, against which an entire hemisphere had no defense. The conquest of the Aztec Empire was a military and political event, but the catastrophe that followed it, the one that truly remade the continent, was biological, and no one planned it, no one fully understood it at the time, and no human strategy could have stopped it. There's a terrible irony folded inside this. The conquest is remembered as a story of human will, Cortés's audacity, the Tlaxcalan's calculation, Cuauhtémoc's defiance, Moctezuma's hesitation. We tell it as a drama of choices, and those choices were real, and they mattered. But the deepest force at work was something that cared nothing for any of their choices, that would have happened more or less regardless of who decided what, the moment the two worlds touched. The empire might have survived Cortés. It could not survive the plagues. No empire could have. The contact itself was the catastrophe. Everything else was just the shape it happened to take. And the survivors, the 1 in 10 who lived, inherited a broken world. The Spanish built a new society on the ruins, and it was a brutal one. The conquerors divided the land and the people among themselves, claiming the right to the labor and tribute of the surviving indigenous population, a system that was, in practice, often little better than slavery, working people to death in fields and mines, especially the silver mines that would make Spain rich and would consume indigenous lives by the thousands. A rigid hierarchy of caste calcified over the generations, with the Spanish-born at the top and an elaborate, obsessive ranking of everyone else below, defined by ancestry and blood, a whole architecture of inequality built to keep the conquered in their place. The old gods were driven underground or fused in strange and resilient ways with the new faith. The temples became churches. The festivals took on saints' names. The people were baptized, sometimes by the thousands, often with little understanding and less choice. An entire religious world, the world of the fifth sun and the blood debt and the feathered serpent, was officially abolished, though it never entirely died, surviving in fragments, in syncretism, in the persistence of old ways beneath the surface of the new. And what of the people whose names we've followed through all of this? Malintzin, Doña Marina, La Malinche, the woman without whom none of it could have happened, the only bridge between the two worlds, faded from the record after the conquest in a way that feels almost deliberate. She had borne Cortés a son, one of the first children of the two worlds mingled. She was eventually married off to one of Cortés's men. And then she simply disappears from history, dying young, the exact circumstances unknown. The woman who had stood between the two most powerful men on the continent, who had carried every word that passed between empire and invader, who had arguably shaped the fate of millions, vanished into obscurity, remembered afterward mostly as a symbol, argued over, condemned as the great traitor, reclaimed as a survivor and a mother of a new people, never quite allowed to be simply a human being who had been thrown away as a slave and used the one power she had. Cortés himself, the man who had conceived and executed the most audacious conquest imaginable, did not get the ending he surely imagined for himself. He became fabulously titled, granted vast lands, a marquis, but he was never given the lasting power he craved. The crown, wary of letting any one conqueror grow too strong, never made him the governor of the land he had won. He spent his later years tangled in lawsuits and disputes, watching others administer the empire he had created, increasingly sidelined, increasingly bitter. He sailed back to Spain to press his case at court and was, by his own bitter account, ignored, left to wait among the crowd by a king who had little more use for him. There's a story that he forced his way up to the royal carriage to be heard, and when the king asked who this man was, Cortés answered that he was the man who had given him more provinces than his ancestors had left him cities. Whether he said it or not, it captures the truth of his end. A man who felt he had handed an empire to his king and been forgotten for it. He died in Spain, embittered and litigious, his greatest deeds already passing into a legend that would belong to everyone but him. None of them really got what they wanted. Cortés wanted power and was sidelined. The soldiers wanted gold, and most of them got little, dying poor after all of it. Moctezuma wanted to understand the signs and protect his world, and lost both. Cuauhtémoc wanted to save his city, and watched it burn before they hanged him. Malintzin wanted, perhaps, only to survive, and survive just long enough to be made into a symbol she never chose. The whole enterprise was a machine for grinding down everyone who touched it, conqueror and conquered alike. And at the end of it, the only clear winners were the microbes and the distant crown that collected the silver. But here is the thing that resists the despair. The thing I want to make sure we say clearly before this story closes. The people did not vanish. The demographic catastrophe was real and immense, the worst imaginable. But it was not extinction. The peoples of central Mexico survived. Battered, broken, reduced, oppressed, but not erased. They endured. The Nahuatl language, the tongue of the Mexica, is still spoken today by well over 1 million people. The descendants of those who built the floating city, who walked its causeways and worked its chinampas and traded in its great market, are still here, not as a museum exhibit, not as a memory, but as living people, woven now into a new society that emerged from the collision, a blending of two worlds into something neither could have predicted. The food, the words, the customs, the blood, they carried forward, transformed but unbroken. The conquest tried to erase a world, and in the most important way, in the survival of the people themselves, it failed. The city was destroyed. The empire was destroyed. The books were burned, the temples thrown down, the gods driven into hiding. But the human thread did not snap. And there is something in that, something stubborn and quiet and almost defiant, that I think matters enormously when we try to understand what the fall of the Aztec Empire really means. Worlds end, but people, somehow, go on. Diminished, changed, carrying the wound across the generations, but on. So let's go back to the question we started with. Back at the very beginning, standing on that ordinary street, I asked you, how does the most powerful empire in the Americas vanish so completely that we build our cities on its bones and forget? And now you've walked the whole length of the answer. So let's look at it clearly, because it's not the answer most of us were given. The story we're usually told is that a handful of Spaniards conquered an empire of millions. And every word of that sentence is misleading. A handful of Spaniards did not do it. They were the spark, the catalyst, the strange new piece on the board. But the army that destroyed Tenochtitlan was overwhelmingly made of indigenous peoples, the empire's own subjects and enemies, rising up to settle a century of scores. It was less a foreign conquest than a continental civil war, with the Spanish as the catalyst that tipped a balance of hatred that had been building for generations. And they did not really conquer the empire so much as the empire collapsed under forces that the Spanish themselves barely understood. The plague did more than the swords. The internal divisions did more than the cannon. The empire was not a unified nation defended by a loyal people. It was a structure of domination, hated from within, primed to shatter the moment something gave its enemies the courage to push. And it was never inevitable. That's the part that haunts me most. Strip away one piece of luck and the whole thing comes apart. If the Tlaxcalans had finished the Spanish in those first battles instead of allying with them, if Moctezuma had attacked while Cortés was weak instead of inviting him in, if the sentry hadn't spotted the column on the Night of Sorrows, or if she'd spotted them 10 minutes earlier before they'd crossed even the first gap, if that one infected man had died at sea instead of carrying smallpox up the mountain, if the prophecy of the gods' deliverance had come at a moment when the Allies' faith was stronger, any of 100 small hinges could have swung the other way, and the story ends with a few hundred dead foreigners and an empire that endures another century, or 2, or 3. It was not destiny. It was not the superiority of one civilization over another. It was contingency, a chain of accidents and choices, and one catastrophic stroke of biological bad luck, any link of which could have broken. We tell it as inevitable because we already know how it ends, and the things that have already happened always look inevitable in the rearview mirror. But to the people living through it, nothing was certain. It hung by threads, again and again, right up until the end. And yet, and here's where it turns strange, the Mexica themselves believed it was inevitable, or came to believe it. Remember the omens, the tongue of fire in the sky, the temple burning from within, the weeping woman in the streets, crying out to her children, the mirror in the bird's head, showing armies marching out of the night. We talked at the start about how those omens were probably shaped or invented after the fact, by survivors trying to make sense of the unbearable, reaching for the only explanation that could make a catastrophe this total feel like something other than blind chance and human failure. It was written. The gods had decreed it. There was nothing we could have done. Now sit with the full weight of that, because there's a kind of cruel comfort in it that runs in two directions. For the conquerors, fate made the theft righteous. They were only the instrument of a destiny already written. And for the conquered, fate made the catastrophe survivable, because a doom written in the stars is not a doom you have to blame yourself for. You did not fail your children. The gods did. The omens were always there. You never had a chance. But the contingency I just walked you through says something far more disturbing than fate ever could. It says they did have a chance. Several of them. It says that this was not written anywhere, that it could have gone differently, that the threads could have held. And that is so much harder to live with than destiny, because it means the ending was not inevitable. It was simply what happened, which means it could have been otherwise, which means every world that ends might have endured. There is no comfort in that. There is only the vertigo of how thin the difference is between survival and oblivion. And there's a deeper irony still, one we touched at the very beginning and that I want to bring all the way home now. The Mexica built their entire civilization around a single fear, the fear that their world would end. The fifth sun was fragile. It had to be fed. They spilled rivers of blood, generation after generation, in a desperate cosmic bargain to hold off the ending of everything. And the ending came anyway, not as they imagined it, not jaguars, not flood, not the sky catching fire. It came as bearded men from across the sea, as a translator who had once been a slave, as a disease no one could see, as the accumulated hatred of their own subjects. It came as history, not as myth, but it came. The thing they feared most, the thing they organized their whole existence to prevent, arrived. And all the blood they had spent to prevent it bought them nothing. Worse than nothing, because the blood they spent had created the very hatred that destroyed them. The captives on the temple steps came from the peoples who would one day march with Cortés. The sacrifices meant to save their world helped guarantee its ending. That's not a comfortable lesson. It doesn't resolve into a neat moral. But it's true, and it's worth carrying. A civilization can be brought down by the very thing it built itself to do. The mechanism of survival and the mechanism of destruction can be the same mechanism. They fed the sun to keep the world alive, and the feeding is part of what killed the world. There's one more thread I want to pull, because we set it up early and it pays off here, at the end, more quietly and more deeply than anywhere else. Remember the poet king, the ruler across the lake in Texcoco, whose verses were obsessed with impermanence, who looked at jade and gold and the most precious things human hands could make, and said, in essence, even these break, even these we leave behind. Nothing on this earth lasts. We are here only for a little while, like a flower that opens in the morning and is gone, like a song that is sung once and then is silent. He wrote those words while the empire was at its height, while the city blazed with life, while the markets roared and the temples stood, and the whole confident world seemed permanent and eternal. He was telling them, in the language of poetry, the one thing the entire civilization was built to deny. He was saying, this too will pass. You too will be a memory. The flower closes. The song ends. Nothing you build will last. And they treasured his poems, recited them at feasts, wept over their beauty, and then went back to acting as if their world would stand forever, as if the blood debt could be paid forever, as if the fifth sun would never set. And then it set. And the poet was proven right in the most total way imaginable. The jade broke. The gold was melted into bars or sank to the bottom of the lake. The songs fell silent. The flower closed. The city that was supposed to be eternal lasted, as a Mexica city, barely 200 years from its founding, and was unmade in a single summer. He knew. Somehow, in the middle of all that confidence and power and blood, one man knew that it was all passing, that it was all already passing even as it stood at its peak. And there is something almost unbearably moving in that a civilization which spent so much trying to hold off its own ending also produced, from within itself, the clearest, most beautiful expression of the truth that nothing holds. That the same people who climbed the temple steps to keep the world from ending also sang at their feasts that everything ends. They contained both, the terror and the wisdom, the denial and the truth. But I don't want to leave this only at the scale of empires and armies and microbes, because that's not really where history lives. History lives in single bodies, in single nights, in the small, unbearable moments that never make it into the chronicles. So, before we close this, let's come all the way back down. Let's stand inside it. Imagine you are an ordinary person in Tenochtitlan, not a king, not a warrior, not a name anyone will ever write down. You are a woman who works one of the floating gardens, or a man who carries goods to the great market, or a potter, or a weaver, or a mother of small children. You have lived your whole life in the most magnificent city in the world. You have never known anything else. The causeways, the canals, the white temples catching the dawn, the roar of the market, the smell of the lake. This is simply what the world is. It is permanent. It is the center of everything. The gods have chosen your people. The sun rises because of the offerings. The empire is eternal. You have no reason to imagine otherwise. No one in your family, going back as far as memory reaches, has imagined otherwise. And then, in the span of about 2 years, you watch all of it come apart. First the strangers, far away, a rumor from the coast. Then the omens, the dread settling over the city like a weight no one can lift. Then the news, they're coming, they're inland, they've taken the empire's enemies as allies. Then they're here, walking the causeways, and your god king goes out to meet them, and you lower your eyes the way you've done all your life, and you wonder what these pale, bearded beings are. Then the impossible. Your god is a prisoner in his own city, and the strangers melt the sacred things into bars of metal. Then the massacre at the festival, the dancers cut down, people you knew, people you'd seen perform that dance every year of your life, butchered in the holy courtyard. Then the war. Then the night the strangers fled, and you thought it was over, you thought you'd won. You danced in the streets and offered thanks. And then the sickness. Imagine it coming into your house. Imagine the fever, the pustules spreading over your children's bodies, so thick and so painful that they cry when you try to hold them, that they can't bear to be touched. Imagine there is no one to help, because everyone you would turn to is sick too. Imagine watching your neighbors' houses fall silent one by one. Imagine being too weak to fetch water, lying in the dark, listening to the city die around you, not understanding what this is, why this is, what you did, what offering was missed, which god you failed. Imagine burying your children, or being too sick to bury them. Imagine surviving. And the survivors did survive, that's the thing. Someone lived through each of these houses to remember it. Imagine surviving and crawling back into a thinner, emptier, grief-soaked city, only to learn that the strangers are coming back, with ships, on the lake. Imagine the siege, the water cut, the thirst, the specific, maddening thirst of a city surrounded by water it cannot drink, watching the lake all around it and dying of dryness, the food running out, eating bark, eating insects, eating dirt. Imagine watching the brigantines on the water and the enemy on the causeways and knowing there is no way out. The bridges are gone, the canoes can't break the blockade, and still your young king will not surrender. And part of you is fierce with pride at that, and part of you just wants it to end, just wants water, just wants to stop watching the people around you starve. Imagine the last day. The enemy pouring into the last district, the place where the great market used to be, where you used to buy your food and meet your friends and live your ordinary life, now the killing ground of the final stand. Imagine fleeing across the causeway in that exodus of the starving, past the lines of your enemies, leaving behind the only world you ever knew, the city of your whole life, now a field of rubble and corpses and the smell of death, walking out into a future you cannot imagine and do not want. That happened. Not to a symbol, not to a statistic, to hundreds of thousands of specific human beings, each one as real as you are, each one with a whole interior life, with people they loved and small daily hopes, and a sense, right up until it shattered, that their world was solid and would last. Every one of those tens of thousands of deaths in the siege was a death like the death of someone you love. Every one of the millions lost to the plagues was a person who woke up one morning in a world that made sense and watched it stop making sense. The number is so large it goes numb, but the number is made entirely of individual, unbearable moments stacked up past the horizon. We have to keep remembering that, or the history becomes a kind of lie, a clean, abstract drama of kings and conquerors, with the actual human catastrophe edited out. And then, they built a city on top of it. We talked about that. The new capital rising on the bones of the old. The temple torn down for its stones, the cathedral razed, the canals filled, the memory paved over so thoroughly that the heart of the buried city was lost for 4 centuries until a work crew struck a carved stone in the ground. I keep coming back to that image because I think it's the truest image in the whole story. The buried city, still there, underneath. The drowned and demolished heart of Tenochtitlan, lying beneath the foundations of a living modern metropolis, beneath the traffic and the concrete and the ordinary noise of an ordinary afternoon. The very thing I described to you at the very beginning, before you knew what was under your feet. Because that's not just the fate of Tenochtitlan. That's the fate of every world that has ever ended. They don't vanish. They get built over. The new world rises on the rubble of the old, using the old world's own stones, and the people of the New World walk around on top of the buried old one without ever quite feeling it there. Underneath every city is an older city. Underneath every certainty is the wreckage of an older certainty that the people of its day were just as sure would last forever. We are all, always, walking on the bones of worlds that thought they were eternal. And someday, this is the thought I can't shake, the one this whole story keeps pushing me toward. Someday someone will be walking on ours. Someday the things we are certain are permanent, the structures and beliefs and powers we cannot imagine the world without, will be the buried layer beneath someone else's ordinary afternoon. We look at the Mexica and we think, how could they not see it coming? How could they keep acting as if their world would last forever when it was already ending? But that is exactly what we do. That is what every civilization has always done. The poet king's words weren't only about the Mexica. They were about us, about everyone. Nothing on this earth lasts. We are here only for a little while. The fall of the Aztec Empire is not a story about a strange and distant people who made strange and distant mistakes. It's a mirror. It's a story about what it feels like to live inside a world that is more fragile than you can bear to believe, to organize your whole life around a permanence that isn't real, and to be proven wrong not slowly, over centuries, but suddenly, catastrophically, in the span of a single human lifetime. It happened to them. The threads that held their world together were thinner than they ever imagined, and they snapped. And there is no law of the universe that says ours are any thicker. But I don't want to leave you there, in the vertigo, with the floor gone out from under the world, because that isn't where the story actually ends. It would be easier in a way if it were, if the fall were total, if the silence after the city were the final sound, if the paving over were complete and nothing remained beneath it but stone and bone. That would be a cleaner story, a simpler grief. The end of a world, full stop, the book closed and shelved. But it isn't true. And the truth is stranger and harder, and in the end, more beautiful than the clean ending would have been. Because the empire fell. The city drowned. The temple came down stone by stone, and the gods went silent, and the gold was melted into the holds of ships bound for a king across the ocean. All of that happened, but the people did not vanish. That is the part the conquest could not accomplish. The part that no plague and no siege and no cathedral built on a temple's bones could ever quite finish. The structure died. The people lived. Think about what that actually means. The empire was a machine of domination, tribute and terror, and the long blade on the temple steps. When it broke, the machine was gone, and good riddance, said the millions who had hated it. But the human beings who had lived inside that world, who had spoken its language and sung its songs and farmed its floating gardens and carried its memories, they were still there. Diminished, devastated, grief-hollowed, ruled now by strangers and dying in waves from diseases that kept coming for a century, but there, alive, carrying something forward that the conquerors, for all their power, could neither see, nor seize, nor melt down into bars. They carried the language. This is the thing I find almost impossible to fully absorb. The tongue that was spoken in the markets of Tenochtitlan, the language of the poet king's verses and the priest's prayers, and a mother calling her children in from the canals at dusk. That language did not die when the city did. It is still spoken today. Not as a museum piece, not as a scholar's reconstruction, but as a living tongue in living mouths, by well over 1 million people, 5 centuries after the summer the city fell. The empire that tried to make the whole world speak its name is gone. The language that empire spoke survived the empire's death. There are children alive right now who are learning, as their first words, the words that were spoken on those causeways before any European had ever seen them. Sit with that. The conquerors burned the books. We talked about that. The codices fed to the fire. Whole libraries of knowledge turned to ash by men who could not read them and feared what they could not read. an erasure so thorough that we will never know the full shape of what was lost. They burned the writing, but they could not burn the speaking. The words went on, mouth to mouth, parent to child, down through 500 years of conquest and plague and contempt and forced labor and every pressure a ruling power can bring to bear on a language it would rather see disappear. And the language refused. It is still here. That is not nothing. In a story this drenched in loss, that is very close to everything.
And it wasn't only the language. The blood survived. Not the blood spilled on the altars, but the blood in the veins, carried forward into the people who would come after. The conquest did not replace one population with another. It fused them, violently, unequally, tragically, but it fused them. The vast majority of the people in Mexico today carry the Mexica and their neighbors in their ancestry, walking descendants of both the conquered and the conquerors, of the woman in the floating garden and the soldier on the causeway, of Malincin's world and Cortez's both. The face of the modern nation is, in large part, the face of the people who were supposed to have been erased. They were not erased, they were transformed, and they endured the transformation, and they are still here, and they know it. The foods endured, the corn and the chocolate and the chili and the tomato, the things the Mexica grew and ate and traded in that roaring market, which traveled out across the whole world after the conquest and quietly conquered it back. There is hardly a kitchen on earth now that does not use something the people of Tenochtitlan were the first to cultivate. The empire's tribute lists are forgotten. Its crops feed the planet. The names endured. The name of the place itself, the word that the lake people used for their world, lives on in the name of the modern nation, so that every time anyone, anywhere says the name of that country, they are speaking, without knowing it, a fragment of the language of the drowned city. The conquerors built their capital on the ruins and gave the country the conquered people's name, and that name outlived the conqueror's empire too. So when I tell you the city was paved over and forgotten, I have to tell you the other half of it now, because they belong together. The city was buried, but the people were not. The structure was erased, but the thread of human memory, the language and the blood, and the food, and the names, and the stubborn private knowledge of who they had been, that was never fully cut. It went underground, the way the city went underground, and it waited, and it surfaced again, changed but alive. And then, 4 centuries later, the city itself surfaced too. Remember how it was lost, the deliberate forgetting, the temple pulled down to its foundations, the foundations buried, the cathedral and the palaces and the great square laid over the top, the canals filled with rubble, and the rubble paved, until the heart of Tenochtitlan was not just hidden, but genuinely unknown, a thing people walked over for generations without any clear sense of what slept beneath them. The maps of the old city faded into legend. Scholars argued about where exactly the great temple had even stood. The drowned world had become a rumor under the floor of a living one. And then, in the 20th century, the work crews started finding it. A carved stone struck by a blade in the dark of the earth. A wall where no wall should be. And then, one day, something enormous. A vast stone disc, carved with the dismembered body of a goddess, the moon goddess thrown down by her brother, the war god, the image that had lain at the foot of the great temple steps for the bodies of the sacrificed to tumble down upon. They found her in the ground in the middle of the modern city, where the electric company was digging. And when they understood what she was, they understood that the great temple was right there, exactly there, beneath the blocks of the living capital, where it had been all along. And so they began, carefully, to dig the dead city out of the floor of the living one. Not all of it. Most of it is still down there, and always will be, because you cannot demolish a capital of millions to excavate the one beneath it. But a piece of it. The base of the great temple, the twin stairways, the stone serpents, the platform where the world had been kept alive with blood. It is open now. You can stand at the edge of it, in the center of the modern city, with the cathedral on one side and the traffic on the other, and look down into the exposed roots of Tenochtitlan. The thing that was buried to be forgotten is now deliberately, tenderly remembered. The erasure has been, in part, undone.
There is something almost unbearably fitting in that. The Mexica believed nothing they built would last. The poet king told them so. The conquerors believed they had ended that world for good, paved it under, closed the book. And both were wrong in the same surprising direction. The stones came back up out of the ground. The goddess at the foot of the steps waited 500 years in the dark and then was lifted back into the light. The act of remembering turned out to be a kind of resurrection, not of the empire, which is gone and should be gone, but of the truth of the people, of the proof that they had been here, that they had built something staggering, that they had been real. You cannot bring back the dead, but you can refuse to let them be forgotten. And that refusal, it turns out, is one of the few powers the living have that even an empire cannot take away. So picture, now, the chain of it. The whole impossible chain of memory that reaches from that drowned summer all the way to this exact moment, to you, listening to this, wherever and whenever you are. It starts with the survivors, the ones who walked out across the causeways in the exodus of the starving, who lived through the unlivable and carried it in their bodies. One of them, many of them, sat down, in the years after, with the few who could still write, or with the new conquerors' priests who wanted to record what had been, and they told it. They told the omens and the strangers and the God King's captivity and the massacre at the festival and the night of sorrows and the plague and the siege and the thirst and the last day in the market. They put it into the surviving books, the ones written after, the ones that escaped the fire. They sang it in laments, and we still have some of those laments, the sorrow songs of the broken city, where the survivors cried out that the roads are full of broken spears, and the houses are roofless and red, and the waters are dark with what the city poured into them. They handed the story down, a grandmother to a grandchild, a keeper of memory to the next keeper, mouth to mouth, in that language that would not die, across 500 years and 20 generations, and an ocean of forgetting that did everything it could to wash the story away. And it didn't wash away. It reached the scholars and the storytellers. It reached the books, and then the better books. It reached, eventually, here. It reached this telling, and through this telling, it has reached you. You are, right now, the most recent link in a chain of remembering that began with a starving survivor walking out of a dying city with the weight of the whole catastrophe in their chest, determined that someone, someday, would know what had been lost. You are the someone. This is the someday. The thing they refused to let die has, against impossible odds, arrived in your mind. That is what a story is. That is the only afterlife the dead are ever guaranteed, to be carried a little longer in the minds of the living who agree to remember them. And I think that's why this story matters, finally, beyond the dates and the battles and the grim arithmetic of the dead. Because every one of those hundreds of thousands who died in the siege, every one of those millions who died in the plagues, was someone who would have wanted exactly this: to not be entirely forgotten, to have it known that they lived, that their city was beautiful, that their world was real, and was loved by the people inside it, and did not deserve to simply vanish from human memory as if it had never been. We can't save them. They've been gone for 500 years. But we can do the one thing that's still possible. We can know that they were here. We can refuse the final erasure. We can keep the lamp lit a little longer. Which brings me back, one last time, to the poet across the lake. I keep returning to him, and I want to tell you why. Because it's the thread that ties the whole thing together for me. He ruled the city of Texcoco, the second great power of the Alliance, in the generations before the fall. And he was a builder of gardens and waterworks and law, a king by every measure of his world. But what survived of him, what reached down across the centuries to us, was not his power, it was his poetry. And his poetry was almost entirely about one thing: that none of it would last. He looked at everything his civilization was most proud of: the jade, the gold, the feathers of the sacred birds, the songs themselves. And he said, again and again, in image after image, "This breaks, this fades, this ends. We do not live on the earth forever, only a little while. Even the jade shatters, even the gold is crushed, even the quetzal feathers tear. We are like a painting that is being erased, like flowers that wither, like a song that is sung and then is over. We come only to dream," he said. "We come only to sleep. It is not true. It is not true that we come to live on the earth." He wrote that at the height, while the temples stood and the markets roared and the empire stretched from sea to sea and the whole confident world seemed eternal. While the very people who treasured his verses were climbing the temple steps to feed the sun and keep the world from ending, he was singing, gently, in the most beautiful words his language could hold, that the world ends regardless, that nothing they built or fed or fought for would stay, that they were flowers, and the morning was already half over. And then his great-grandson's generation watched it all come true, every word of it. The jade broke. Literally, the precious things were shattered and melted. The songs fell silent. The temple songs stopped. The festivals ended. The priests were gone. The painting was erased. The city itself was rubbed off the face of the earth and paved over. The flowers withered. The dream ended. He had told them, in poetry, exactly what was coming, not as a prophecy of armies and ships, but as a deeper prophecy about the nature of all things, about the one truth their entire civilization was organized to deny. And the truth kept its appointment, the way it always does, the way it will with us. But here's the part that turns it, finally, away from pure despair, the strange grace hidden inside the sorrow. The poet said nothing lasts. The poet said even the song is sung once and then is silent. And he was right about almost everything. The empire didn't last. The city didn't last. The gods didn't last. The gold didn't last. The power, the tribute, the terror, the whole vast machine, none of it lasted exactly as he said. The song lasted. His song lasted. The very poem that says nothing survives has survived. 500 years, the fall of the empire, the burning of the books, the drowning of the city, the century of plague, the ocean of forgetting, and the words are still here. We are saying them right now. The one thing he was sure would fade is the one thing that reached all the way down to this moment and touched you. He was wrong in the most redemptive way a person can be wrong. He said the song would end, and instead, the song is the only thing that didn't. The flowers withered, and the jade broke, and the painting was erased, and the empire fell, and the song, the fragile, mortal, here only a little while song, the song endured. And maybe that's the truest last chapter of all. Not that everything ends, though everything does, but that the telling of the ending can outlast the thing that ended. That a civilization can be erased from the earth and still reach forward 5 centuries to make a stranger ache for it. That memory is the one offering that actually works, the one bargain with oblivion the Mexica never knew they'd already made when they treasured a poet's grief at a feast. They fed the sun with blood to keep the world from ending, and it ended anyway. But they fed something else, almost by accident. They kept the song. They cherished the words. They handed the grief forward. And that is what kept a piece of their world alive, long after the sun they bled for had set on them for good. So let me take you back now to where we started, back to the street. I asked you at the very beginning, before you knew any of this, to stand on an ordinary street in an ordinary modern city on an ordinary afternoon. Cars, concrete, the hum of an enormous living metropolis going about its day. Millions of people moving through it without a thought for the ground beneath their feet. And I told you that under that ground, under the pavement and the foundations and the buried pipes and the layers of 100 forgotten yesterdays, there was a city, a drowned city, A vanished world. Now you know which world. Now you know whose feet walked those buried causeways, whose hands built the temple whose roots they have dug back up in the middle of the traffic, whose voices filled the market that is now a square full of strangers who mostly do not know they are standing on it. Now, if you ever find yourself there, in that vast, modern capital that rose on the corpse of the lake city, you will not be able to walk across the great central square the same way again, because you will know, you will feel it under your shoes, the weeping woman in the streets, the dancers cut down in the courtyard, the night the bridges came up and the gold dragged men to the bottom, the thirst, the last day in the market, the exodus of the starving, all of it, down there, in the dark, beneath the ordinary afternoon, held in the ground like a held breath. And you will understand, standing there, the thing this whole story has been trying to say, that the solid world is not solid. That the permanent thing is not permanent. That every confident, roaring, eternal-seeming city is built on the bones of one that was just as sure of itself and will one day be the bones beneath another. The people in that square, hurrying to work, checking their phones, certain of the floor beneath them, they are exactly the people of Tenochtitlan, walking the causeways at the height of the empire, certain that the white temples would catch the dawn forever. The only difference is which side of the ending they happen to stand on. And none of us, ever, knows that. That's the vertigo. But by now, I hope, it's not only the vertigo, because the same ground that holds the catastrophe also holds the proof of endurance. The same dig that uncovered the Temple of Blood uncovered the evidence of a people of staggering genius and beauty and humanity, a people who built a floating city out of a swamp, who fed 300,000 souls, who kept their streets cleaner than the great cities across the sea, who wrote poetry about the impermanence of all things while standing at the peak of their power. The buried city is a tomb, but it is also a monument. It says, "A world ended here," and it says, just as loudly, "A world existed here, and it was magnificent, and it was real, and it was loved." Both things are true at once, and learning to hold them both is, I think, the whole of what this story has to teach. The ending was real, and it was a horror, and nothing redeems the suffering of those hundreds of thousands of human beings who watched their world stop making sense. And the existence was real, and it was a wonder, and nothing the conquest did can unmake the fact that they were here and built something that still takes the breath away 5 centuries on. Grief and awe, the tomb and the monument, the fall and the flower. You don't have to choose. The story is big enough to hold both, the way the ground in that square holds both the death and the proof of the life. I want to leave you with one last image. Not a battle, not a king, not a number. Something small. Somewhere in the years after the fall. We don't know exactly where or who, because the small things are never written down. There was an old woman who had been a girl in Tenochtitlan before the strangers came. She had been a child on the causeways when the city was whole. She had seen the white temples catch the morning. She had heard the markets roar and smelled the lake, and lowered her eyes when the God King passed, in the days when all of that was simply the world, permanent and eternal and unquestioned. And then she had lived through every page of what you've just heard. The omens, the strangers, the captivity, the massacre, the night of sorrows, the plague that surely took people she loved, the siege, the thirst, the last day, the walk out across the causeway, away from the only world she had ever known, into a future that had no place in it for the world she carried in her chest. And she survived. Old now, in a city that was no longer her city, ruled by people who were not her people, in a world that had been rebuilt on top of the one she remembered, she survived. And one evening, in the language that would not die, she told a child what it had been like, the floating gardens, the temples in the dawn, the market that had everything the world could offer, the way it felt to live at the center of everything and believe it would last forever. And then, gently, because the child had to know, what had happened to all of it.
She didn't tell it so the child could avenge it. There was no avenging it. She didn't tell it for power or for a record or for history. She told it for the only reason that has ever really mattered, so that it would not be forgotten, so that one more mind would carry it forward, so that the world she loved, which was gone, would live a little longer in the only place a vanished world can live, in the memory of someone who agrees to keep it. And that child told another child, and that one told another, mouth to mouth, grief to grief, love to love, down through all the centuries and all the forgetting, 20 generations holding the fragile song against the dark, until it reached the books, and the books reached the tellings, and the tellings reached this one, and this one reached you. The old woman on the causeway of memory got her wish. The thing she could not bear to let die did not die. It is here. It is in you now. You are the child she was telling. You always were. That is the strange immortality the Mexica never knew they had purchased. Not the immortality they bled for on the temple steps. That one failed. The sun set. The world they fed ended anyway. The other one. The accidental one. The one that comes from being remembered. They are 500 years gone. The woman in the floating garden and the warrior on the causeway and the young king who asked for the blade rather than the cage, and the old woman telling the child by the evening fire. Gone past any hope of return, and yet here they are, in your mind, right now, alive in the only way the dead are ever allowed to be alive. You are their afterlife. This telling is. And when you carry it forward, when you stand in some square someday and feel the buried city under your feet, or tell someone what was lost, or simply remember, on some ordinary afternoon, that the solid world is not solid, and the people who came before us loved their fragile worlds exactly as we love ours. You become the next keeper of the song. The poet was right. Nothing lasts. And the poet was wrong, in the only way that ever mattered. The song lasts, as long as someone is willing to sing it. Think, before we close, about the names, about which ones survived and which ones didn't, because the pattern of it tells you something about how memory really works, and how unfair it is, and why the work of remembering matters so much precisely because it is so unfair. We know the conqueror's name. We know it well. It is carved into cities and streets and the spines of 1,000 books. We know the names of the kings, the god king who was taken hostage and the young one who chose the blade, because kings are written down even by the people who destroy them. We know the name of the translator, the woman who stood between two worlds and whose name still stirs argument 5 centuries later. A handful of names rose to the surface of the catastrophe and floated there, preserved, repeated, fought over, remembered. And beneath them, the silence, the hundreds of thousands, the woman in the floating garden, the potter, the weaver, the mother carrying water at dusk, the dancers in the courtyard, the children burning with fever in the dark houses, the old woman telling the child by the fire. Not one of their names came through, not one. They are the overwhelming majority of everyone who lived and died in this story, and history kept almost nothing of them. No name, no face, no record that they were ever specifically, individually, here. They are the buried city of the buried city, the forgotten beneath the forgotten. That is the ordinary cruelty of how the past is kept. It remembers the few who held power, and forgets the many who simply lived, as if the living were only a backdrop for the powerful, as if a civilization were its kings and not its mothers and its potters and its children. We inherit a story full of names that belong almost entirely to the people at the top, the ones who ordered the deaths and the ones who died as symbols, and a vast, nameless darkness where everyone else used to be. And it would be easy, telling this story, to do the same thing all over again, to make it a tale of Cortés and Moctezuma and Cuauhtémoc,
a drama of 3 or 4 great men and one extraordinary woman, with the hundreds of thousands as scenery.
But the hundreds of thousands were the empire. They were the ones who built the floating gardens out of nothing but reeds and mud and patience, dredging the lake bottom by hand, weaving the living roots into islands, turning a swamp into the most productive farmland in the world. They were the ones who carried the stone for the temples and kept the causeways clean, and ran the market that astonished men who had seen the great markets of Europe. They were the ones who learned the calendar and the stars, who wove the feathers and worked the gold and the obsidian, who sang the poets' songs at the feasts and wept at their beauty. The genius of that civilization was not in its kings. It was distributed across 1,000,000 anonymous hands. And those hands are exactly what history threw away. So when we remember Tenochtitlan, I think the deepest act of remembering, the one that pushes back hardest against the cruelty of how the past is kept, is to remember them, the nameless ones. To hold in your mind not the conqueror on his horse, but the woman in the garden at dawn, the specific human being with a whole interior life who woke each morning in a world she believed was permanent and tended her floating field and loved her children and had no idea, none, that she was living in the final years of everything she knew. She has no name we can speak, but she was the realest thing in this entire story, and she was real exactly the way you are real, and she deserves to be remembered more than any king. This is for her, all of it, the whole long telling. It was always underneath for her. And the lake is gone now, drained over the centuries until the floating city sits on dry, sinking ground. The water that made it possible vanished as completely as the empire it carried. The temples are rubble in a museum. The gods are silent. The gold is scattered to the ends of the earth, or lying somewhere in the mud beneath the streets, where it has lain for 1,000 years, and where it will lie until the modern city, too, becomes the buried one. The empire that organized its entire existence around the terror of the world's ending got its ending, in full, exactly as it had always feared and never imagined. The fifth sun rose the next morning over the ruins, and it did not care. And it has risen every morning since over the city built on the city, indifferent, the way it was always going to be indifferent, the way it will be indifferent over our ruins too. But the song reached you. Across 5 centuries and an ocean of forgetting, and the deliberate erasure of an empire that wanted the whole thing paved over and gone, the song reached you. The old woman's evening fire is still warm in your mind. The white temples are catching the dawn behind your eyes right now, in the only place they still stand. The market is roaring. The causeways are full. For just this moment, because you remembered, the drowned city is not entirely drowned. That is the quiet power that outlasts every empire and every conqueror and every plague. Not gold, not armies, not stone, but the simple, stubborn, almost defenseless act of one mind holding the memory of another and refusing to let it go dark. It is the smallest power there is, and it is the only one that has ever reached across 500 years and touched the dead and called them, for an instant, back into the light. The Mexica bled an ocean to make their world immortal and failed. You did it just now, for free, by listening. That is the strange and gentle joke at the center of all of this. The thing that lasts is the thing they never thought to value, the thing that costs nothing and weighs nothing and asks nothing but attention. A story carried forward. A world remembered. A name we do not even know, kept anyway, in the dark, like a candle cupped against the wind. And then the moment passes, the way all moments pass, the way the poet always said they would. The image fades, the city sinks back beneath the pavement and the traffic and the ordinary afternoon. The grandmother's fire goes dark again, and the world goes on, walking over the buried world without feeling it, certain of the floor, the way we are all always certain of the floor, the way the people of Tenochtitlan were certain, right up until the morning the floor gave way.
But it was here. For a moment, held in your mind, the whole of it was here again. And that is enough. That has to be enough, because it is the only kind of forever any of us were ever going to get. The most magnificent city in the world. The empire of millions that bled to keep the sun alive. The young king who chose the blade over the cage. The poet who knew, at the height of it all, that none of it would last, and was right, and whose knowing is the only thing that did. The one small flame that the whole drowning of that world could not put out. A whole world, complete, beautiful, terrible, beloved, and gone. Drowned beneath the city that conquered it. Held in the ground like a held breath, under the feet of people who do not know, on this ordinary afternoon, that they are standing on a vanished sky. It rose out of a swamp and became a wonder of the earth. It stood for 200 years and believed it would stand forever. And in the span of a single human lifetime, it was undone by ambition, by betrayal, by plague, by the accumulated weight of its own cruelty, by 100 small accidents that could each have gone the other way and didn't. It fell, and the lake closed over it, and the centuries closed over the lake city, the floating world, the fifth sun's last great altar. And this was one of history's last chapters.